Hello, I'm Arvind Ethan David, the author of Douglas Adams' The Ends of the Earth. Welcome to your bonus video section. First, let me say a big thank you to all Kickstarter backers who supported this project, and in particular, those of you who paid for the bonus video. Some of this stuff made it into the book, but now you get to see it in its full, luxurious context. We've included here 4 interviews with people who were either very important to Douglas, or to whom Douglas was very important to them, or, in most cases, both. Also included is a wonderful Q&A session that Douglas did with some young students around the year 2000. We hope you enjoy. I'll pop up again introducing each of these as they come, but for now, sit back and press play. The first piece on the bonus video is a Q&A session that Douglas did at MIT somewhere in the late months of the year 2000, i.e. quite near the end of his life. The video quality isn't amazing, but the thought quality really is. This is Douglas at the absolute peak of his intellectual and creative powers. He's tired, he's a little bit run down, nursing a cold, but my God, the brain at the size of a planet is operating on every cylinder. My personal highlights are his answer when asked about metaphor and its utility, and also the extraordinary discussion on how politics might evolve in a digital age. Enjoy.
You like talking about other animals, either on, in this book on Earth, or as many of us know, on other planets. You like different worlds, different animals, different stories. What's next?
Right. Well, I've spent the last few years doing other things other than writing books, because I kind of just I got bored of sitting in a room typing, and then going out on author tours and sitting in a room writing my name over and over again. So I've been doing a bunch of different things, for the sake of what I call sort of mental crop rotation. And one thing that comes up from time to time over the last 20 years is every now and then a plan suddenly emerges, a very exciting plan to make a movie of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And usually we get so far and then something goes wrong. That's happened twice so far. We seem to be having a problem again right at the moment. But we've gotten much, much further than we ever have done before, in that we have a producer with a lot of money, we have a studio, we have a director who's suddenly become the hottest director in Hollywood, Jay Roach, who made the Austin Powers movies and has just made Meet the Parents. And we also have, what we've never had before, is a script that everybody involved in making the movie absolutely loves. But we have hit 2 problems, one of which is we've lost the studio executives who are our supporters at Disney. So we're trying to find somewhere else to take it, but at the same time, the Screen Actors strike, which is due to happen on June the 30th, is looming, which means it now does not stand a hope in hell of being made before then. And so we've got to look at making it now about 18 months in the future. This is driving me mad. This is driving me absolutely mad. But before I say, now there's actually an awful lot more to say about this. There's a huge amount to say that I actually don't want to say at the moment. And what I would like to do is actually kind of ask your help here, because Jay Roach and I are giving a joint webcast in about 3 weeks' time. We haven't got the exact time and date yet. But if you want, it'll be on Yahoo. So if you, sometime in the next few days, go and check on where they have their schedule of webcasts on Yahoo, or go to douglasadams.com. or go to h2g2.com. Then very, very soon there will be an announcement of exactly when this webcast is due. And I would really love this to be an enormously highly tended webcast, if we possibly can, because we have some mindsets to change. And I thought we'd got a home run with this because we'd just got exactly the right number of people who were committed to making this movie. And just once you lost 2 of them, we suddenly find, once again, the same old problem with Hollywood, which is that it is not a typical Hollywood picture, and they really, really want typical Hollywood pictures. And, I go around the rest of the world, and I know there are millions of people out there who want this movie, and Hollywood looks at it and says, I don't get it. And so, as I say, we have some mindset changing to do, and I really want to make a great, great deal out of this webcast and all the things we can get to happen out of it. So I would please urge you to give us your support. Come to the webcast, which, as I say, will be round about 21st of November, sometime in that week. And, if we can knock a few heads together, it would be great. Otherwise, the next project I'm onto is a novel which I've actually been sort of twiddling around with for years. And now it's interesting. The thing is that one of the reasons I gave up when I did was, as you may have noticed, my novels tend to sort of use up ideas rather fast. And I just found doing, one a year or sort of, I guess it was sort of 2 every 3 years, for a while, I'd just run out. I was just, and I got halfway through one and thought, I'm just writing this automatically. It's no good. And I'll go off and do other things. And so as a consequence, it's now, the best part of a decade since I've written a novel. And I've just got so many ideas again now. It's great. So that's what I'm going back into. But what I really love is to be able to do kind of books and novels books and movies in tandem. That would be great to be able to do that. But I mean, who wouldn't? I'd like to win the lottery as well, and I'd like to. But that's kind of what I'm aiming to do at the moment.
Thank you for being here. Have you received, since the time that the book was published, have you received updates on any of the animals you covered?
Yes, I have. And some of it's good news and some of it's bad news. The II, as I say, when I was there, it was thought there were only about 15 left in the world. Since then, 2 small colonies of them have been discovered on mainland Madagascar. And there are, so now there are, I don't know exactly how many, but quite a few dozen. And in fact, I had a very, very weird experience because since they were discovered, since those new ones were discovered, there are now 3 in Paris Zoo, which is, one has, as you might imagine, mixed feelings about zoos, but there they are. And so I went to Paris Zoo and was allowed to actually go into the enclosure with the IIs, of which there were 3. And it was very, very weird for me because this animal that I'd seen for 10 seconds once and that had come to sort of form such a sort of large presence in my imagination and thoughts. And suddenly they were clambering all over me. It was quite extraordinary. The kakapo is up from about 40 up to nearly 50 now. But through the absolutely unrelenting, tireless, fantastic amount of work being done by the bunch of guys there who look after them and have airlifted them to safe haven islands and so on. It's quite extraordinary. So that's good news. The bad news is the Baiji dolphin. Now, when we were there, they were down to about 200. And in fact, the Chinese were doing fantastic efforts to try and conserve them, but in vain, because they're now down to 20. But that is not the end of the bad news, because, as you may know, the Chinese are embarking on this vast and completely misbegotten project to dam the Three Gorges, which is one of the most beautiful things in the world. Dams, as we know, almost without exception, don't work. Not only in terms of the damage they cause, but almost always in terms of the actual objectives for which they were set up. So the Three Gorges Dam will be almost without doubt an immense environmental disaster, and probably an immense technical disaster as well. And it will, without a shadow of a doubt, cause the extinction of the final Baijis. So that's very sad. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we have a question from the overflow room.
Oh, okay, sure.
They were wondering if you could answer two quick questions. One, who is your favorite author? And two, is it true that there will be another Hitchhiker book?
Who's my favorite author? Well, a bunch of boringly obvious ones, like Dickens and Austen. Evelyn Waugh, Kurt Vonnegut. I like. Now, there's one particular writer who is a genre writer, an English woman who's a crime fiction writer, and people don't think of crime fiction as being necessarily a repository of great art. But this particular woman, who writes under two different names, one is Ruth Rendell and the other is Barbara Vine, and she produces the most phenomenal number of books. And she is a very, very, very fine writer indeed, who I have huge admiration for. But I guess my sort of chief of writers, the one I would put above all, is P.G. Wodehouse. And what was the other one?
Will there be another Hitchhiker book?
I've no idea. I mean, if we finally get this bloody movie done, I probably will. But the other thing I want to say about that is that, I mean, the last book I wrote was Mostly Harmless, which is not probably my favorite of the Hitchhiker books, and I think it's not most people's favorites either. It's a rather dark book, and people try to speculate about all sorts of complicated reasons for that. It was simply I had a lousy year. And it was a year I really wouldn't want to have to live through again. And on top of it, having to try and write a comedy science fiction book was, didn't produce exactly the right results. So it's a rather bleak and dark book. So there's a bit of me that kind of wishes that the whole series as it exists at the moment didn't end on quite such a sort of dark and bleak note. So because I've got loads of material for another Hitchhiker book, it only takes to do some real organizing to do it. I think I should one day. I don't want to do it next, though, because the book I'm writing at the moment, which is it's actually something completely new for me. It's a kind of comedy science fiction. I thought, why not branch out a bit? Actually, I tried, because I'm going to do an e-book as well, actually, because I've been talking about it for years, and then Stephen King went and did it, and I thought, oh, stupid me, you know. So I sat down actually to try and write a sort of non-funny, hard science fiction book, and I just didn't seem to have the right muscles for it. But I don't want to give up on that. I want to have another go, because I'm determined I can do it. And it was an idea I'm particularly fond of, but maybe I'll just have to end up sliding some jokes into it. I don't know. So I mean, in fact, there are lots and lots of different projects. There's one very, very interesting one that I think would cause a considerable stir if people knew about it. But it is not by any means signed, sealed, and delivered yet, so I'm not going to talk about it at all, because I know the one thing that would guarantee that it wouldn't happen is my saying that it will, or even saying what it is. So.
For those of us that are studying or working here at MIT, we find ourselves in the unique position of, at times, being caught in the midst of this advancement of stick technology. And we were wondering, I mean, now that you've somewhat convinced us that we're puddles waiting to evaporate, now what?
No, we're already
What do
aware
we
of the
do?
possibility that we might evaporate. What, sorry, what's the question?
So then what exactly is our place in this, and what should us as individuals attempt to do? Since you
Oh,
came
you
to
want
talk...
that answer?
Yes. And it's not 42.
I think it's just a question of understanding and awareness of what we're doing, and slightly more sort of self-critical than we necessarily have been. I am absolutely not in any way opposed to technology. If anything, I'm a sort of, sort of rampant enthusiast for technology. And people say that, technology moves much too fast now. I think it's complete nonsense. Technology has moved far too slowly. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, for most of our earlier time on this planet, by which I mean about the first 97% of it, we went around in bunches of about sort of 2 or 3 dozen of us. And so the world we lived in and the people we knew, we were intensely aware of, and our communications were very, very intense, very intimate. We knew and understood our world terribly well. Now we've suddenly become so damn many of us that we can't communicate with each other properly anymore. We can't. There's all sorts of things that we're unable to do, and our technologies have not caught up with that. Finally, with things like computer-mediated communications that allow us to get sort of peer-to-peer, allow us to have many-to-many communications, which we used to have, to allow us to have interactive forms of entertainment and education and communication again. It's about bloody time. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, at the end of the 20th century, suddenly we had this new buzzword, interactivity. But the 20th century is the only time we've ever needed that word, because the 20th century is the only century that has been dominated by non-interactive forms of communication and entertainment. Radio, television, movies. However you react to a movie, doesn't change the way it behaves, and it's completely unlike anything we've ever had before. If you went to a play or a concert or somebody telling a story or singing a song, it was the audience was there. The audience was part of the experience. So it doesn't mean to say you're jumping up and down and interrupting, or saying no, I want a different ending. But nevertheless, the reaction of the audience is an enormously important part of what's going on, and we've kind of lost all that. So I think the quicker that technology can reclose this gap, the better. Now, I think we live in enormously exciting times, and I get very fed up with people who sort of say, "Oh, we mustn't do this and we mustn't do that." Well, because let's face it, we're going to. So why not? I think you can adopt two. You can adopt two strategies. One is to say, "Oh, this is all terribly bad, and we must go as slowly as we can," and blah blah blah, which is rather like the way I ski. My wife, whose reaction to a black slope is just to toss herself off it, and just goes down with complete control, leaning out from the slope as you're meant to, and has a great time and gets there and has actually achieved something. And I'm sort of leaning into the slope and sort of falling over and hurting myself. And I think now it sounds as if I'm saying two contradictory things here, and I'm not. I think that one of the interesting things about our technology at the moment is the enormous range of insights it's now giving us into life and how it works. And that, I think, more than anything else, will increase our sense and understanding of the value of it. So I think our technologies, now that we're merging into much lighter weight, much smarter technologies, that we're doing something much, much better than the things we're trying to recover from at the moment, you know, the sort of giant smokestack technologies of the last couple of centuries. So I'm absolutely an advocate for increasing our understanding. And science and technology absolutely go. You cannot divorce the one from the other. The one drives the other, and the other drives the one. And so I think that, you know, I would absolutely applaud everything that MIT and so on are doing. I think we're living in, you know, enormously exciting times. And here's one of the interesting things. I mean, I guess from the first moment we started to invent tools, we kind of started to take control of our environment. And we've kind of shielded ourselves thereby from the abrasive effect of our environment. And thereby we've sort of shielded ourselves from, you know, the possibility of further evolutionary development, which, as you know, tends to happen from the abrasion between, you know, a species and its environment, which includes, of course, other species. And because we've so much buffered ourselves from that, you know, it's as if we've pressed the pause button on our own evolution. And we're not likely to see that start to move again until small numbers of us sort of wander off to other planets and so on, suddenly have to contend with completely different situations. I mean, what tends to drive speciation, as we know, is when a sort of, you know, small group of animals might sort of wander off, be split off from its main body by some geological upheaval or population pressure, something has changed. And supposing a small group of animals finds itself in a range where perhaps the temperature is a bit lower. And you'll find within a very few generations that genes that favor a thicker coat will have come to the fore, and the animal will have a thicker coat. Now, human beings, we tend to work slightly differently. We don't, you know, when we've managed to colonize every kind of climate in this planet, but we arrive somewhere it's a bit colder. Instead of having to wait for the evolutionary process to winnow out those of us who haven't got good thick coat genes, and we just see an animal that's already got a thick coat, and we say, we'll have it off him, you know. So in a sense, you know, our evolution has kind of transferred itself out of our bodies and into, if I can slightly sort of Shanghai beyond what he meant by it, a phrase of Richard Dawkins, the extended phenotype. I mean, you know, our bodies are the phenotypes of our genes. But if you look at, say, a beaver, then the dams it builds are part of the extended phenotype of the gene. So if you look at human culture, I mean that is a vast extended phenotype of our genes, and really our evolution, if you like, has kind of moved into that territory, and all sorts of interesting things happen as a result. I mean, there's no doubt that, I mean, before long, I mean, I would hesitate to say whether we're talking about 10 years or 100 years, but we're going to start seeing the emergence of machine intelligence. I mean, that's on the one hand very exciting, but also very alarming because of the way we might react to it. I mean, there's a certain amount of evidence, if you look back over our history, we are kind of, I mean, a human species is on a little bit of an island. You know, you go quite a long way before you reach, you know, the gorillas and the chimpanzees and, you know, the other sort of African apes, and we are African apes, as you know. So there's quite a moat around us. And if you look back at history, it looks as if we may have killed off the Neanderthals and, you know, all the other things that were close to us but not us. So we've got a very bad history from that point of view, and you only have to look back at the last couple of centuries and see our appalling history and sort of racism and genocide and so on. We do have that kind of instinct within us, which we don't always control as we might. So I've a horrible sense of what might start to happen when we start producing machine intelligences, i.e. other entities that are like us but not us. because we're likely to be extremely aggressively fearful of them. When you only have to look at popular culture. Anytime, you look at sort of B science fiction movies, which is basically what we make these days, isn't it? And whenever, whenever anybody trips over a vat of chemicals and has a sort of electric charge go through them, and suddenly they become A, much more intelligent, and B, which we know because they have lights coming out of their eyes, and B, and absolutely as a consequence of that, absolutely unquestioned as a consequence of that, evil. And the whole job of the rest of the movie is now to kill this person. It's kind of terrifying, that, and whenever we have movies in which have machine intelligences, you got to kill them. They're the Borg, So we are frighteningly xenophobic, and so I hope we're going to. I hope that terrible things won't happen as the result of our creating machine intelligences, and I'm not saying because there's anything wrong with the idea of machine intelligence, but because there may well be something wrong with the way we react to it. Okay, thanks. Hello, hi.
I was wondering what the green balls with arms and mouths on the covers of some books are.
Oh, I've been asking. I've been asking myself that for years. I went on a crusade for a decade or so to get rid of it. We finally have. I think it still turns up on the omnibuses. I hate it. I wish it would go away. What is it? It's an abomination.
In your talk today,
Our next question from the other room
Oh,
is,
sorry.
do you think that Doctor Who had the most freedom for you as a writer because of being more inventive in time travel and space travel, and would you like to be involved in it again with the new audios, books, and the rumor of a new movie coming out?
I always had a lot of fun with Doctor Who because it wasn't mine. It does give you more freedom. It was rather like, remember sort of Joan Rivers standing in for Johnny Carson. It was kind of fun because it wasn't yours, you had a kind of license, So yes, I love Doctor Who. I've never been interested in writing a Doctor Who book or doing more Doctor Who on television or anything like that.
in your talk today, and indeed in many of your books, you use these exquisite metaphors to convey very complicated ideas. And indeed, Frost said that if we're not vested in metaphor, we can't cross the street. Can you comment a little bit on the importance and of metaphors and how you're able to come up with such wonderful...
Oh, it's a bit late in the evening for commenting on It's like how you communicate with nuclear submarines. We each have a very, very small bandwidth through which we can reach each other. Only a very small number of words we actually exchange. But each of us have got huge numbers of stored experiences that very likely there's quite a lot we share. So by invoking those shared experiences, you can invoke a whole range of ideas. Now, the reason I say it's like communicating with a nuclear submarine is that as you know, the bandwidth available for communicating with nuclear submarines is very, very low. We all have, sort of 56K modems or T1 lines. I remember once reading somebody saying that once we'd all got optical fiber to our houses, it would be more like libraries of Congress per second. It should be, and somebody's seriously proposing that as a measure. It would be LCS, Libraries of Congress per second. But I think the baud rate for communicating with a nuclear submarine is about 1. So the problem is, how do you give instructions to a nuclear submarine? How do you tell it what's going on? Because the chances are that any point at which you've suddenly got a complicated idea you want to express to a nuclear submarine, it may be a bit of an emergency. So they set to sea with enormously compendious code books full of this scenario, in this case this, and in that case that, and just huge, every scenario anybody can possibly think of, they've got stored on the submarine. So somebody can just send a message saying, it's X, Y, Z, and they go and look it up. Ah, okay, that's what we're doing. So that's what a metaphor is. It's the X, Y, Z that sort of triggers, triggers the shared experience in somebody else's head.
Excellent metaphor.
XYZ, sorry, I have to remember which side of the Atlantic I'm on.
With respect to the kinds of concepts that you've tried to impart to us tonight, do you find in general in your experiences with people around the world that they're amenable to these kinds of ideas and that they understand the concept that, mankind might not be in a world that was completely built to suit him? Do you find it easy to communicate these ideas, or do you ever run into difficulties? And how do you work around that to try to, I guess, educate people more efficiently? Is there any advice you'd give in that direction?
In some places it's easier, sometimes it's harder. I mean, certainly from where we're sitting at the moment, the further west or south you went, it would get harder. Simply because I was going there about 10 times a year. And from London, that's a hell of a hike. So I was just trying to cut down commuting. It was...
Our next question is, again, from the other room.
And I like the sun.
Many people have said that the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series went downhill after the first book. How do you respond to this? Do you think it's true, and is this a common pattern for authors? And do you have any advice you can give to an aspiring author to prevent this?
Advice on how to prevent it? Well, stop after the first book. No, I think, from my own point of view, my favorite of the Hitchhiker books, well, it depends on different criteria. I mean, I think my favorite is, for the ideas in it, is the second book. I think my favorite scene of all is in the second book, which is the one of the ruler of the universe. I think the best individual passages are in the third book, Life, the Universe, and Everything. It's funny, whenever I do, as I do from time to time, not as often as I used to, when I do sort of performance readings, most of it comes from the third book. It's got the best passages in it. But on the other hand, it just, for some reason, it's kind of broken back as a story. It doesn't, and it's the only one I went in with an absolutely clear storyline to begin with. And it's the only one where the storyline doesn't work. The first two were just kind of one damn thing after another. So there wasn't really any storyline worth breaking. The first... the first, obviously, I'm terribly fond of in all kinds of ways because of what it came to represent and so on, and it's got some stuff that I really like in it, but it's not my favorite of them.
If you'd been a failure as a writer, what would you have done with your life?
What I would have done if I'd been a failure, I actually don't know. But what? Well, what I was going to say was if I had known then what I know now, then there are all sorts of other options that I would have considered as well as being, and certainly being a zoologist is one of them. It I cannot tell you how far it was from my mind, back when I was sort of 19 or 20, to think that zoology might be remotely interesting. Certainly, computer science is something else I would very, very happily have gone into. I mean, I still remember, when I was about, 15 or something, and there were these people who would often stay behind and do an extra class after school, and I'd occasionally sort of look into the window and see them appearing to be sticking knitting needles through playing cards. And I couldn't figure out what on earth it was about. What were they doing? And the answer was they were training to be billionaires. But I find computer science enormously interesting. So that's another thing I might have considered. The other thing I would have liked to have been is a rock musician. And I did something I'm always very proud of telling people. One of the sort of highlights of my life was, let me see, it would have been 1994? October 1994. October the 23rd, 1994. At Earl's Court in London, I got up and I stood up and played guitar with Pink Floyd. On stage with Pink Floyd. It was a good moment. You can see why they do it. You really, really can. It isn't just the sex and the drugs, it is actually the rock and roll. Do I play guitar? Yes, I do. Yes. I think they probably would not have asked me if I... No, it was my 42nd birthday present from David Gilmour. So. Yep.
So if you were going to go around looking for a whole bunch more animals to get a last chance to see and write a book about it, which animals would you look for? Any off the top of your head?
I would want to go underwater. So a whale or a marine dolphin or something of that kind. I don't know. I would probably... It's funny, I can't think. I mean, I've drawn up lists over and over again and can't think. I mean, the thing is, I don't particularly want to do one at the moment because it would mean being away from home for an awfully long period of time. And with a daughter growing up, she's 6 at the moment. I just don't want to be at home that way much. But I would like to do it again. I'm going to wait till the hormones kick in. Then I'm going to leave home just like that. So when she's about 12 or 13, that's when I shall go and do another last chance to see. I'm sorry, off the top of my head I can't think, but I know that I've drawn up lots of lists. Actually, the monarch butterfly would be an interesting one to sort of pursue. I'd certainly want to do something in Australia. There's a snowy white possum up in the Queensland rainforest that might be a good one to go for. But I don't know.
While I don't have the immunity of being in a different room while I ask this question.
Say it again, sorry?
While I don't have the immunity of being in a different room while I ask another question about the Hitchhiker's Guide, I want to ask you, it's an enormous book with so many things, and there might have been several real instances which prompted particular instances in the book. parallels that you might draw. Are there any such that you can relate, which we can relate to? B, as part of that, why 42?
The question why 42, I just sort of, I can't say anything more about it other than, I just haven't got the words to describe how much it didn't mean anything more than that it was a joke. You know, I don't.
Just to make sure.
What was the first bit again?
Yeah, it was.
What were the other things? I mean, you know, things happen, and I mean, the great thing about writing science fiction is, you know, some little thing happens that sort of interests you or annoys you, and science fiction enables you to exaggerate wildly about it. You know, so you tend to take events that you find around you and just sort of disguise them. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, you're next. Beg your pardon.
Okay. What's been your biggest culture shock between living and working in the U.S. as opposed to living and working in the U.K.?
That's a very interesting question, actually. I mean, the thing is, there's something I've come to realize through living here that I hadn't spotted through years of coming backwards and forwards and spending huge amounts of time here. It's rather like if you come backwards and forwards, I mean, in any given year, I'd probably be here about 3 months, you know, but on and off. So you get a lot of dots. It's only through living here that you connect the dots and suddenly see a different pattern. And, well, I mean, you can probably guess what one of them is, which is suddenly realizing what a profoundly religious country America is. I was asked at one point, shortly after I'd moved here, if I'd go and talk at something called the Convention of American Atheists. And I went along and did. But I couldn't imagine why you'd need such a thing. I mean, what's the big deal about being an atheist? And suddenly discovered, you know, through turning up to talk, that they were a pretty beleaguered and oppressed bunch. And I think, well, people can't take religion that seriously, can they? I mean, in England, we've moved from a kind of sort of wishy-washy Anglicanism to a kind of wishy-washy agnosticism, which basically means we don't really want to think about it very much, you know. I mean, the point about the Church of England is to dress up in frocks. And when you meet an awful lot of people who really, really think that there is a big spirit up in the sky who made the world, it's kind of rather alarming. I mean, you really, really think, I mean, you know, it's just, it's, you know, it's like the sort of Tooth Fairy and Father Christmas and something. You can't really think, but the rapidity with which people believe that here is extraordinary, and the sort of the things it infects. I mean, I remember I was driving from Los Angeles back up to Santa Barbara on the day that Joseph Lieberman was put on the Democratic ticket as vice presidential candidate. And I was, you know, twisting the radio dial, and I just happened upon a sort of a political talk station. And I was absolutely chilled. I was absolutely astonished. I could not believe what I was listening to, that everybody was talking about him in terms, first of all, in terms of him being Jewish, and second of all, in terms of rabid anti-Semitism that I would not have thought you would have heard on this world after Germany in the 30s. I could not believe it. so that's the main thing, actually. That's the thing that has completely shocked me rigid. What else? Dishwashers. When we first when we first moved over, we were in a rented house for a bit, and there was something wrong with the dishwasher, and we couldn't get. And about the third time, we got the guy out to fix it. He sat us down and gave us a little talk, and he said, "Look, I can tell you're European. I can tell by the accent, and there's something you should know, because I know about European dishwashers. And in Europe, you expect dishwashers to wash the dishes for you. In America, the dishwashers expect you to wash the dishes for them." That's another.
So I've read all of your novels, and I have been to quite a degree an admirer of yours, and this is the first time I've ever heard of you being alarmed by anything, quite frankly. And this actually characterizes your writing in that you will take even the most profound idea that other authors will try to make the reader slack-jawed about, and then cut it down at the knees and use English understatement. And
oh, that vicious understatement. Oh.
But on the other hand, if any other author here had a personal stake in wanting to turn people's attentions to species disappearance, he would probably do the equivalent of grabbing each reader by the head and screaming at his ears. And you're probably the only author who can, with very reliable success rates, convey the same ideas and not have to resort to that.
Well, I think the thing is, in my experience, if you try and bang somebody around the head with an idea, they'll tend to want to put their head somewhere else. So it's better to kind of engage their interest and enthusiasm and give them. It's funny. I mean, I have to say that one of the things that the whole Last Chance to Sea experience came out of, because first of all, the trip to Madagascar was just a sort of a newspaper asked me to go, and then that led me to do everything else that then went into the book, and my mention of Madagascar is just in the sort of prologue. While we were there, and I was walking through the rainforest at one point, so I said to Mark Carwardine, and who I'd only just sort of got to know that week, so come on then, what's so great about the rainforest that we're meant to be so sort of excited about it, and what's so special about it anyway? And he told me. And it took him about 3 minutes. And I suddenly realized that I had just understood something, therefore I'd never understood before, and that it had completely changed the way I saw things. And it's amazing how an explanation that you actually get is the sexiest, most exciting thing that can happen to you. When you suddenly think, oh, I understand that. Yeah, that makes a difference. Now, if that, then surely, this must follow. Yeah, it does. Well, does that mean that, yeah. And does that mean, no, it doesn't mean that actually, because you've got to look at it this way around. Oh, I see. I mean, it's just the most exciting, wonderful thing. And so if you can, and the way I tried to write the book, given that, setting out on those journeys, I didn't know anything about this. I hate the kind of travel book which sort of starts, the last time I was up the Orinoco, it was, you think, immediately you are coming from a different place than the author. He's trying to tell you all the stuff he knows that you don't. So one of the great things actually about writing Last Chance to Sea, as far as I was concerned, was actually starting off from the same point of lack of knowledge as the reader, and sort of taking them through the process by which I came to know and understand these things. And if you can take the audience with you on that kind of journey, then you'll have a much better effect than sort of standing on top of a mountain, lecturing them or hurling rocks at them. Okay.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi. I have two quick questions. One is, have you ever actually met David Bowie? And the other one was, have you ever heard of Ghost in the Shell before?
Have I heard of what?
Of Ghost in the Shell. There's a movie, an animated movie, and it's also a large comic book. And from what you were talking about before, I thought you would be very interested in it.
I haven't met David Bowie, and I haven't read Ghost in the Shell. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
sorry
please,
to be so negative.
Yeah, please look into it, though. It's.
Oh, okay.
Oh, the comic book, not David Bowie. I'm sure you know all about him, so. Yes. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of yes or no questions from the overflow room. Or, well, one answer questions, rather. Who would you vote for U.S. president? And did Alta Vista pay you royalties for the use of the term Babelfish?
Who would I vote for president? Well, first of all, it seems to me extraordinary that out of 250 million people, it comes down to those two. Having said that, I have to say, I know one or two people who know or have worked with or have had dealings with and know something about Al Gore, and I know they have a lot of respect for him. It does seem to me to be extraordinary that, again, going back to that sort of joining up the dots thing, I mean, you always thought this slightly satirically before, and I now realize it is actually true that people are actually going to vote on who's got the nicest smile. I would vote for Gore over Bush 1,000,000 times. But of course, I mean, you're now sort of moving into sort of three-party state situation with Ralph Nader. So you have this appalling problem of, well, if you vote for Ralph Nader, you're probably going to get George Bush in. So do you either vote for Ralph Nader and therefore make the Green Party, the third party, more of a force, even though it's not going to get in, when the effect of that is you're going to get George Bush in, or are you going to vote for the person you least don't want? If you're a Nader supporter, that I guess would be Al Gore. And the moment people, because we've been doing this for years in England, always voting for who you least don't want. And that's a kind of terrible situation. But I think, going back to the sort of digital thing, one of the things I noticed moving over here is that when you have to sort of plug yourself into a new system and sort of get a whole sort of admin of your life going, then anything that you're able to do for yourself happens at internet speeds. Anything that involves the government, like getting driving license, social security card, all that, happens at geological speeds. And after a while, I think people are going to start taking note of this and saying, sorry, exactly what function is it you're performing? I know that it costs us billions of dollars, and I know that it infests our television screens for while we hear you discussing absolutely nothing with each other. And that this is meant to be terribly important, but I'm beginning to wonder if it is actually that important when we can actually micromanage our own lives much, much more effectively. Here's a thought, which is that, any political economist will tell you, you actually have more effect as a member of a sort of economic political culture. Every time you walk down a supermarket aisle and say, well, I'm going to buy this, and I'm not going to buy that, and I think I'll have 2 of those, than you do when you put a tick in a box every 4 years. And that's why everybody's so desperately keen to get that information. They used to stand around with white coats and clipboards. Now they've got electronic point of sale. You know, all that stuff. That, you know, all this, when they're ringing that stuff up at the cash register, that's democracy in action. But we don't think of it in those terms yet, because and it's funny how many people will espouse one political cause and actually act differently when it comes to actual financial decisions. And I suspect that there will come a point when, and one of the reasons why we tend to sort of think, we claim to think one way politically and then do something different, is because you're never even really aware of the consequences of any political decision you make, because it'll be years before it has any consequence. It's rather like living in a room which has got a thermostat in it, which is, as we know, is a negative feedback circuit. But the thermostat is set to react 6 months later. You know, you would really get no good sense of the consequences of anything. I think we live in a sort of political culture where we never get the consequence, the actual consequences of what we decide. And I have a feeling that if we shorten the feedback loops, shorten them and shorten them and shorten them, make them more and more local and more and more sort of intimate to yourself, then gradually we'll have the equivalent of a sort of fly-by-wire aircraft that is run by, each of us has our own tiny little sort of negative feedback loops, so that the way that society works, the way that culture works, the way that politics and economy works, is much more reflective of actually what people are doing and thinking and the decisions they're making day by day. And it's not that people think that electronic democracy will mean instead of going out to a voting booth and putting it across, you'll be doing it on your computer screen at home. No, it's much, much more than that. It's much, much more to do with daily micromanagement of stuff that that at the moment, or until now, we've not been able to do, and we rely on vast hierarchies of control to enable to do for us. What was the question?
The other one was, did Alta Vista pay you any royalties for Babelfish?
No, but we did. I mean, the problem is that it was just something I hadn't copied. You have to deliberately copyright something. I'd copyrighted the various titles, and I hadn't copyrighted that. But we did do a sort of a deal whereby, because we have this H2G2 website, which is we're creating an online version of the guide, and that's a commercial venture. When I say commercial venture, I mean it's like .com companies, commercial ventures, i.e. investors put in a lot of money. But we do have a kind of cross-promotion deal with Alta Vista, whereby if you hunt around Alta Vista long enough, you will find a tiny little click-through point that will take you to H2G2.
Okay, at this point, we have time for one more question.
Right. Who's got the best question? What?
Choose someone randomly.
Choose.
All right, simple question. How happy were you with the Dirk Gently books and will there be another?
I was delirious with joy with them.
Okay.
No, I don't know. No, was I happy with the Dirk Gently books? Yes, very much so. But I found I couldn't do a third one then. So no, you've been done out of a question. So when you have your question, so.
What was it like working with Terry Jones?
With Terry Jones? Oh, well, Terry's a great old friend. I love working with Terry. It's funny. I mean, for years and years and years, we used to regularly get together to and have dinner and talk about something we might do together. And after a while, we just enjoyed the dinners, In fact, in this instance, I mean, we didn't actually sort of work together very much. I mean, apart from, I wrote the script that he then did as the Parrot, which was great fun. He did it beautifully. Then, as far as the book was concerned, I mean, the history behind that, because I really wanted to write the book myself, but because I committed myself to the game, the publishers had sort of said, well, we want a book, and the book's got to come out at the same time as the game. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, because how can you promote the book without the game? I said, well, how about my other books which didn't even have games? And they said, well, this is different. It has got one. Anyway, so by that stage, I mean, out of the working on the game had come really a very elaborate backstory. I mean, only a small part of which is actually reflected in the game. And so suddenly had this bright idea. Got Terry, Terry, and we were real panic actually, because the book had to be written within such a period of time. I mean, like 3 weeks. And because the proceeds of the book were cross-collateralizing the game. I mean, how stupid can you get? I mean, normally if I sat down and wrote a book, you go X amount of money. But here I was doing the game, and so somebody else gets to write the book, and the profits from the book, which come effectively as a result of it being my name, then go into the cost of developing the game, from which nobody makes any money. Anyway, so I've got to go and have a word with somebody about this. Anyway, so I was in a bit of a panic, and Terry happened to be in at that point, and we were sort of going over the finer points of character motivation for the parrot. And I was sort of saying, I don't know what to do about this book. So he said, well, I'll write it if you like. And I said, would you? And so he did, yeah, he said, I've got a spare week. And so he sat down and wrote it in about a week. And and every now and then he'd phone me up and say, I'm a bit unsure about this. So we'd sort of, I'd say, well, how about doing it this other way, or just skip that bit? And he'd say, all right, yeah. So that was how it was like working with Terry Jones. Right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Here is my conversation with Sanjeev Bhaskar. Sanjeev is unusual in this selection of interviews in that he didn't know Douglas at all. They never met, even though Sanjeev, a huge figure in British comedy, acting and writing, is perhaps the biggest Douglas Adams fan there is. Sanjeev will tell his own very funny stories of his attempts to get into the hitchhiker's world. Sanjeev is also someone who I view as a big brother, not just because he's an Indian man, a little bit my elder, and a big figure in British entertainment, although there is all of that, but more because he was a trailblazer. His TV series, Goodness Gracious Me, which he created with his now wife, Meera Syal, as well as several other friends and colleagues, was absolutely revelatory for all of us brown folks who wanted to be in entertainment in the England of the 1990s. Never before had we seen ourselves on primetime television being funny. In this way, I suppose Sanj is rather like Bill Cosby, except without the rape. He's a lovely, lovely man, and it's no surprise that he loves Douglas Adams as much as I do.
So this is an excerpt from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the first of Douglas Adams' books, and the one that I fell in love with. Hopefully it will speak for itself, but here we go. It is, of course, well known that careless talk costs lives, but the full scale of the problem is not always appreciated. For instance, at the very moment that Arthur said, I seem to be having tremendous difficulty with my lifestyle, a freak wormhole opened up in the fabric of space-time continuum and carried his words far, far back in time across almost infinite reaches of space to a distant galaxy where strange and warlike beings were poised on the brink of frightful interstellar battle. The two opposing leaders were meeting for the last time. A dreadful silence fell across the conference table as the commander of the Volhergs, resplendent in his black jeweled battle shorts, gazed levelly at the Gugavant leader squatting opposite him in a cloud of green, sweet-smelling steam, and with a million sleek and horribly beweaponed star cruisers poised to unleash electric death at his single word of command, challenged the vile creature to take back what it had said about his mother. The creature stirred in his sickly, broiling vapour, and at that very moment the words, "I seem to be having tremendous difficulty with my lifestyle," drifted across the conference table. Unfortunately, in the Volherg tongue, this was the most dreadful insult imaginable, and there was nothing for it but to wage terrible war for centuries. Eventually, of course, after their galaxy had been decimated over a few thousand years, it was realized that the whole thing had been a ghastly mistake, and so the two opposing battle fleets settled their few remaining differences in order to launch a joint attack on our own galaxy, now positively identified as the source of the offending remark. For thousands more years, the mighty ships tore across the empty wastes of space, and finally dived screaming onto the first planet they came across, which happened to be the Earth, where due to a terrible miscalculation of scale, the entire battle fleet was accidentally swallowed by a small dog. Those who study the complex interplay of cause and effect in the history of the universe say that this sort of thing is going on all the time, but that we are powerless to prevent it. It's just life, they say.
Why did you choose, of all the wonderful bits in Hitchhikers, why did you choose that one?
It seemed to be self-contained. There weren't too many back references or forward references to other things, whereas trying to pick any of the kind of wonderful quotes from the book would have been very difficult without trying to contextualize it. And contextualizing it, in some cases, is very difficult unless you've read the entire book.
A practical choice, then.
A very, very pragmatic choice. My name is Sanjeev Bhaskar. I'm an actor and a writer, a program maker. And I first encountered Douglas Adams through The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Radio 4 series. Now, I didn't know anything about the series at all, but late at night, past my bedtime, when I was supposed to be asleep, I managed to kind of secrete a small transistor radio with one earpiece that I used to cover myself with the duvet and plug it in and then try to find something to listen to. And I came across Hitchhiker's Guide, and although I wasn't one for listening to radio dramas or radio plays at that age, there was something about it immediately that caught my interest in imagination. And it was this combination of humor and science fiction. And as a kid, there was a lot of science fiction about on the television. It's the era of Doctor Who and Star Trek and stuff like that, which I was watching anyway. And humor I'd always been close to, but I'd never seen it really combined. The wonderful thing about audio is that you are entirely focused on the words, the pictures you're making up yourself in your own head. And the combination of that just had me hooked. And so later when the books came out, I kind of devoured them as well. And that led me on to Dirk Gently and discovering other things about Douglas in terms of conservation and all that sort of stuff. But I was pretty much smitten from the beginning.
What age were you?
12 or 13, something like that. So, young enough to be in bed by then and probably asleep, but old enough to appreciate what I was hearing, although I didn't know how or why I appreciated it. But certainly those two factors. So, yeah, I think around 12 probably.
So you already had things in your science fiction imagination, Doctor Who, Star Trek, I guess Star Wars came out the same year. But what did you have in your comedy imagination at age 12? Who were you already a comedy, a comedy nerd kid? Were you already following stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of brought up on, the slapstick stuff from the Silence. So from Chaplin and Keaton through to Laurel and Hardy. and the Marx Brothers. I loved all of those. I think I was just at that time being introduced to Monty Python as well. So that sense of the surreal, the abstract, and, that whole thing that Python brought, which was an unstructured way of doing comedy. And also the Goons as well, from the late 50s, Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers and Harry Seacombe. Their stuff as well, this whole area of comedy that was quite abstract. And so I enjoyed all of that, actually. And there were, sitcoms were sort of normal for evening TV, but they were very sitcom-y. They were very, very structured. You had very, very big characters. Smaller characters were there just to make the big characters even funnier. And the thing that really struck me about Hitchhikers was that even the small characters were incredibly funny. And I don't think I'd really encountered that before. And I suppose Python, with their kind of, if you think about Holy Grail and Life of Brian, there aren't too many characters that are passengers. They all kind of contribute comedically in some way. I'd never seen that kind of combined with humour, certainly not as well as this.
One thing that's interesting about the way you're talking about it, which is unsurprising given what you do, is you're already talking about the craft. You're talking about the sort of technicality of how Douglas's humour works, his attention to small characters, the smashing together of abstract ideas with real-world circumstance, the, as you say, the mixture of the surreal and the abstract. How much did that seep into you, or how conscious were you as you were starting of the technical craft, and were you looking at these people and at Douglas as like, oh, how do they do it? What is the science of their comedy?
I don't think I tried to deconstruct it actually till much, much later. And I suppose, after I started, then you start to look at other people. I mean, at first you are a reader, you're a viewer, you're a listener, you're a spectator. And so you're the people. So you kind of absorb whatever entertainment is coming your way from the very, very basic, am I enjoying it or am I not enjoying it? And so I think when I started writing, and certainly the first thing I did was a sketch show called Goodness Gracious Me, which was the first sketch show with South Asians writing it and performing it. There was also the element of satire as well within Douglas's books. And so certainly those sketches I think some are very abstract, some are a bit weird, some are certainly satirical. And we tried very often, certainly when I was writing, to not make the small characters pointless or meaningless. And so in that sense, I think that certainly with sketch comedy, I think it played a very big part. And then when I did the series, The Kumars at Number 42, which was a comedy, improv, chat show, sort of hybrid, my one little acknowledgement to Douglas Adams was having this family living at Number 42. So I think it's already sat there. I mean, the great comedy sci-fi ideas I've had have yet to materialize. They're all in my head. But, when I at some point do put them down on paper or on a screen of some kind, then I'm pretty sure that the spirit of Douglas will loom large.
You never met him, I think, is that right?
No,
you
never met him.
But you were sort of adjacent, surely. Did you try to? Did you sort of have any desire to meet him, or were you content to be?
Oh no, gosh, I would love to have met him. Even imagining meeting him, I feel slightly kind of overawed just at the thought of it. By the time I'd started, I think he may have passed away by then, actually.
He died in 2001. So
right. Okay. So that would have been just after I started. So within a couple of years. But the first 2-3 years of me working as a creative person in this industry were so new and overawing in its own sense that the idea that I would meet anybody that was a hero was so far from possibilities. I mean, I've been incredibly lucky that I've now met a lot of my heroes. If Douglas had decided to stick around a little longer, then I'm sure that I would have found a way to him. I met a lot of people who knew Douglas and who've met Douglas. And in that sense, I feel kind of like at least 2 degrees of separation from him.
If you don't mind, because it's such a good story, tell the story of your relationship with the Hitchhikers movie.
I mean, I've loved just about every incarnation of Hitchhikers. The books, obviously, I loved the radio series. I loved the BBC TV series. I loved that as well. I think they were pretty faithful to the books, certainly. And then I heard that there was a film being made. I even did a documentary. BBC did this thing about people's favorite books. And I chose Hitchhikers for my kind of contribution. And the wonderful thing about that, the truly wonderful thing about that, was that I got to play Arthur Dent in it. So I was narrating it, but also we cut to sort of clips from the book where I could play Arthur Dent. So when I heard there was a film being made, I thought, this is going to be amazing. This is great. This is big screen, big ideas that Douglas had. So I got my agent to contact them, and I said, look, I will do anything in this film to be a part of it. I'll be one of the people in the pub at the very beginning, just before the earth blows up. I'd absolutely do anything. And I didn't get a thing from it, which was pretty disappointing, I have to say, at the time, given that I said I'd even effectively be an extra, be a supporting artist in it. And then the film came out, and I saw it, and there was a bit of me that thought, thank God I wasn't in it. It seemed to miss the spirit of the book. And so you had the set pieces and you had the characters, but it was missing that slightly surreal edge that Douglas carried throughout the entire book. So, the film was really disappointing in the end. I mean, I wanted it to do well because it was Douglas Adams and it was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But ultimately, I'm glad I'm not just a person in a pub having a pint with my back turned to the camera before the earth gets demolished for a space freeway.
And I think, everybody's heart was in the right place. And there were a lot of people close to Douglas and who loved him involved in that movie. But yes, something about it edged off, as you say, Douglas's hard edge. And you mentioned earlier that there's satire in Hitchhikers and in all of Douglas's work. And that seemed to be missed in the movie. So let's talk about that. What do you think and you are a satirist. You are many things, but you are a satirist, clearly. Like what do you think were Douglas's main targets from the work? What do you think made him angry and what did he want to mock?
Obviously, I can't be definitive about it, but for me, it was about society. It was about authority. The whole idea that the earth is going to be demolished, is going to be blown up, and, the papers were filed in the right places and people didn't look at it and it was their fault. The whole thing was about that sort of bureaucratic nature of there being so much bureaucracy that the people are in the dark. So I think, people's attitudes, I think the fact that, through all the kind of, wonderful characters that come in and out, there was always a satirical thing. And Blowbagger, who kind of was an immortal and then just got bored of being immortals because Sundays were so difficult to fill that he decided to insult everyone on the earth. Again, I think it's a satirical thing. It's about, how do you fill your time? What do people do with their time? What does the regular person do? People dream of being immortal. And, that's always a kind of, a superpower or a kind of a god of some kind. But what happens when you get bored? I mean, all of those things I thought were incredibly clever. And, the ability to turn left in the middle of an idea. So, the whale that turns into petunias, or the dolphins were the smartest beings on earth, or, mice that were experimented on in labs were the ones who were the basis of this great idea. I mean, all of those things were brilliant at sort of turning left in the middle of a thought. And I think within that, that's what satire does well. It does kind of, you have your thoughts and your targets, but the ability to turn left in the middle of that process and illustrate it in a completely different way, I think is a rare skill.
I think that's right. And I think that also explains why there were so many of us who were listening under our duvet covers because his particular genius is not just it is the comedy and is the characters, but it's almost more the ability to see the world differently, as you say, to turn left when everyone else is turning right, to zig when the prescribed course of action is a zag. And there's a sort of telepathy in that. If you feel it rearrange the neurons of your brain, and you go, yeah, no, I see that now. And you almost convince yourself that you saw it first or at the same time.
Yeah.
And that is a peculiar genius. And I also wonder if that is a thing that transcends, well, I think it does transcend traditional boundaries of race and class and specific milieu. Because it's wonderful to think of you playing Arthur Dent. But of course, in the books and in every adaptation, everybody is sort of white and upper middle class British. But, you know, as someone who is also a person of color, is also South Asian and also encountered it at about age 11, none of that mattered then, and it doesn't feel like it matters now. Unlike some, you know, like the greatest of English literature, we feel like we could be Sherlock, we could be Jeeves, we could be Arthur. Have you thought about that, given how much you've done, you know, to sort of break down those barriers in English pop culture and British pop culture?
I mean, it's always the great advantage of having aliens. I mean, the thing is that unless you specify what the alien looks like or what colour their skin was, they could be anybody. I think the only, you know, and I think from the book and from the original series, I think Arthur Dent was a 6-foot ape man. So that kind of gives you, starts to give you pictures. And he's Arthur Dent. And so, you know, there is an image that forms in your head that he's going to be Caucasian. If I remember correctly, it's the only thing that irked me, actually, through all the adaptations, was that I recall, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but from my recollection, Trillian was Indian. And I don't think she was ever played by anyone remotely Indian.
She's never been played by anyone Indian. Is she described as Indian? She's certainly described as having, you know, curly hair. Her full name is Tricia McMillan.
Yeah.
Which is obviously...
She was either half Indian or she was Indian. It was kind of one of the two things, because it's so stuck in my head.
Well, it's going to bother me now. I don't remember that, but we'll go and look. We will go and look and resolve it. I will resolve it after this interview. And
please.
I just want to talk about that idea for a second, though. The idea that I remember being at Comic-Con, and this will take us away from Douglas for a moment, but we can loop it back in. I remember being at Comic-Con and being on a panel, and everyone is cosplaying at Comic-Con. Everyone is dressed up as their favorite characters. And I was on a panel with the cast of Dirk Gently, and a question came, you know, who would you dress up as for Comic-Con? Who's your preferred choice? And everyone gave their answers. And then they came to me, and I said, well, the difficulty is I'm brown, and therefore I can't just put on a cape or a hat and say I'm Sherlock or I'm Superman. I would have to be brown Sherlock or brown Superman. Mm-hmm. And that presents an obstacle in my mind, and not just in my mind, in the culture's mind. And how do we sort of, and you see this, you see the mad, rabid internet go crazy every time a character who's not explicitly off color or off gender, of a particular gender, getting changed, and the dogs of the internet. You know, how do you think of that as a fan and as a creator? How much do you think about those issues, and how much do you think it matters that people do or don't, but particularly people in the canon?
I think unless you're going for historical accuracy, I don't think it matters. I think that, again, as a diversion, in the West End in London, I played King Arthur, King of the Britons, in Monty Python's Spamalot. And when I was cast, I did it for 7 months or so in the West End. And when I was cast, journalists all kind of made reference to me being King of the Britons. King Arthur, King of the Britons. I went, Asian King Arthur, right? And initially I kind of said, well, of course he was Asian, because if you wanted your horse shoed at 3 o'clock in the morning, it was only going to be the Asian shop that was open. So I did all that stuff, but also I then did say to them, I said, sure, I said, when the audience come in, they may well be thinking, when I first go out onto the stage, followed by coconuts, clopping, that, wait a minute, he's not white. And I said, if they're thinking that by the time they leave, then I haven't done my job. And so I think that, with any of those castings, unless you're going for historical accuracy of some kind, you cast somebody good enough, you will forget, you will, buy them as the character. And that is about so many things. It's about the performance, it's about the actor, it's about the writing, it's about how it's directed. I always remember that one of my favorite Shakespeare's on film is Much Ado About Nothing. And this gang of brothers that come in at the beginning of the film, where Kenneth Branagh is the kind of main character. One of his brothers is Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington's brilliant. There's, initially you might go, how are they brothers? How do we need to explain? 5 minutes in, it's Denzel Washington. You're just going to go, okay, they're brothers. I can see the relationship. I can see there's kind of warmth. I can see there's kind of connection. There's a fraternal connection. So, as I said, I think unless you're kind of saying, well, we're doing a film about Winston Churchill and we've got this black guy to play him, if you're going for historical accuracy, I don't think it'll work. But outside of that, I don't see why not.
I think that's exactly right. I think it's not just historical accuracy, they'll go further. It's like, yes, you're right. If it needs the historical specificity because you're playing with, the reality of what race was at that time, then it's, you can confuse your dramaturgical purpose. But yes, no one is coming to the Holy Grail for a historically accurate depiction of medieval Britain.
Right. Right.
The coconuts are the first clue.
First of many. Well, I have to say, when I read the Dirk Gently books, there'd been adaptations of it. And I have to say, and I've probably not said this to anyone before, but I was absolutely desperate to play Dirk Gently. I kind of read it. I thought, I know this guy. I can play him. Why can't I play him? Why can't I play him? And so, for me, it was kind of, I'm not involved in any of the incarnations of Dirk Gently, but that was a character in terms of Douglas's canon where I thought, I could play Arthur Dent. Absolutely, I could play him. But certainly Dirk Gently was the one, because there'd been no adaptations at that time, I absolutely saw myself as that character.
This explains why we love each other so much, because, of course, I did as well. And I went one further. I adapted it as my school play and did play him. And I remember very clearly thinking, well, nowhere in the text does it say he's not Indian.
Right.
So, I'll do it and I will become Dirk Gently. And I think very much his character, this is, armchair psychology on myself, but I remember his character sort of, I was 15 and it's sort of, and I kept making that, I made it again in Oxford, which is when I met Douglas. And I think it's informed who I actually became very, very clearly, that sort of Dirk Gently sense of, well, we'll just say a thing and therefore the thing will be true and we'll charge hard at it. And if it stops being true, we'll say a different thing. Is sort of how I've lived my life. And
follow the thing that you kind of, you want to follow, and it'll take you to where you need to be. There you go.
There you go. I'm in the middle of making. We haven't fully got a home yet, but we're close. The Dirk Gently animated series. So
brilliant.
we will have you come and do some voices, and you can
lovely.
You can get closer to Dirk Gently. The book is kind of about Douglas's big ideas, and you mentioned, going on after Hitchhikers into Dirk Gently, and then reading about other things, his fervor for conservation, his atheism, his satire of bureaucracy and power politics. Those are some of the big animating ideas of his life. Which of those do you share? Which of those helped inform you? Pick any one or two and spend some time on them.
It's difficult to pick one or two, actually. I think that the fact that it seemed to me he was observing or able to observe from the outside. So he understood what bureaucracy did and how it worked and people's attitudes towards it, people who would toe the line, people who wouldn't. I mean, the other thing I think that's striking about Douglas's writing is that, this ability to turn left in the middle of a journey unexpectedly, is that he's constantly taking the road less traveled. And even within entertainment and within comedy, the road most traveled is the one that takes you directly to the punchline. And he would, be able to veer off it. And so it was the road less traveled all the time. And I found that kind of fascinating. And that comes from someone who understands what they're seeing. Because in order to satirize, you need to understand what you're satirizing. So he was able to step outside of it, and in their own ways, whether it was Arthur Dent or Dirk Gently, they're outsiders. And so, for me, growing up as a South Asian, fairly overtly sort of troubled times through the 70s, I absolutely felt like an outsider. So, in that sense, I felt a connection with the way he observed. And my observations may have been about South Asian culture and how South Asian culture clashed or connected or overlapped with Western culture. And that became the basis of the comedy when I started writing it, was to be able to look at those kind of touch points. And as I said, some of them were conflicting, some of them were overlapping. There's a wonderful phrase about bureaucracy that someone once said, which was the British introduced bureaucracy to India and the Indians perfected it. And so, that whole sense of overlap and observation was something that I constantly got from the way he wrote. And that certainly fed into the way that I saw things, because you're part of this society, and yet you can step out and you can observe all these kind of strange kind of trials and tribulations that people have about being part of that society. And so part of me kind of wondered why other people couldn't step out and observe it from the outside as well. But most people couldn't. And that's, in a way, that's where I found my tribe, was when I found other people who could do the same thing, who could, look at what society and their culture and their surroundings, what was happening, but also to step out from it and see how ridiculous and how crazy and how nonsensical it could be. The people within it don't see any of those things. They're constantly just trying to keep up. And the ability to step out from it and to be able to observe it from a different way is what gives you irony. And so that was the thing that I really connected. So rather than one or two areas, I think there was a general kind of feeling that I got where Douglas was coming from a very, very personal level. But also, in order to really appreciate, someone who thinks laterally and writes laterally as well, is that you have to have the ability to go with it. And so don't question it until you got to the end of the journey, because if you start questioning it midway, you're screwed. Right? You're just going to tie yourself up. And that's what happens to people within society. They kind of, that inability to go with the flow whilst observing and whilst putting those building blocks together so you can kind of question it at the end. People sometimes question way too early. And so then they just don't understand where they are, what they're doing, and what anyone else is doing.
Can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by write laterally, and what's an example of question?
Well, there are literal thoughts and there are lateral thoughts. So, that whole thing about being able to turn left is just lateral thought. It's finding a connection which is not the most obvious next step. It's a side step. And, if someone's going in a straight direction, and they suddenly turn left, there are some people who are going, why is he going left? That's completely the wrong direction. His next step may be to curve round back onto the path that you were originally on. So, a lot of people react way too soon. So I think with his writing, and from listening to the show as well, but certainly from reading the books, it was the knowing instinctively that I shouldn't be questioning why we've suddenly started talking about something else here. It was to go with it. Just go with it. Go with it. It'll lead somewhere. And that was the joy of it, because it would, whatever those kind of side steps and lateral thoughts were, they would eventually kind of like curve round into the forward journey. And that was joyous.
That's wonderful. I kind of want you to read one other thing.
Yeah.
There is a Dirk Gently bit that I'm trying to find about Dirk's approach to navigation, which I think connects rather nicely with what you're saying.
In the meantime, can I tell you a small anecdote about Dirk Gently?
Please.
So I knew that these, I read that somewhere that these Dirk Gently books existed, but I couldn't find it. So at the time, I was working as an arts development worker in East London. And I went to my local shop, I think it was a W.H. Smith's, and I said, can I order a book here? And they said, yes. And I said, it's called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency by Douglas Adams. And they said, okay, yeah, we can order it for you. Yeah, it'll be here in about a week. And I went, great. So a week later at lunchtime, I went over to W.H. Smith's because the book should have arrived. And there was a long line of people. Lunchtime, people were buying, sandwiches and crisps and drinks and whatnot. So there were about 9 or 10 people in this line. And I got to the front and the girl said, can I help you? And I said, yes, I ordered a book and I've been told that it's arrived. And she said, what's it called? I said, Dirk Gently. And that was the name of the book. I said, it's called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. She said, holy what? And I said, it's just Dirk Gently. I mean, it's Douglas Adams is the author if you've got them by author names, or Dirk Gently. And she said, oh, hold on, I'll ask. And she turned around and shouted to the woman behind her, some way behind her, and said, this man wants Do It Gently by Douglas Adams. I said, it's called Dirk Gently. The people in the line are looking at me. I said, it's not that. It's not Do It Gently. It's not that kind of book. Anyway, you got it? So, yeah, that was my route to getting it.
Wonderful. Although you are just describing my life. Imagine having pitched this thing, dozens and dozens of times over the years before we finally made it at Netflix. And the bane was always the title. Every executive wanted to change the title. They're like, it's too long, it's hard to say, what is it, Gently? Stubborn refusal eventually was correct. But to this day, have you made anything I would know? Have you seen Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency on Netflix? Have I seen what? It's got Elijah Wood in it. Shut up. I found the bit. I'm going to put it in the chat.
Okay, so this is obviously a sight reading, cold reading, but here we go. A minute or two later, Dirk paused to consider his best strategy. Rather than arrive 5 hours late and flustered, it would be better all round if he were to arrive 5 hours and a few extra minutes late, but triumphantly in command. Pray God I am not too soon would be a good opening line as he swept in, but it needed a good follow-through as well, and he wasn't sure what it should be. Perhaps it would save time if he went back to get his car, but then again, it was only a short distance, and he had a tremendous propensity for getting lost when driving. This was largely because of his method of Zen navigation, which was simply to find any car that looked as if it knew where it was going and follow it. The results were more often surprising than successful, but he felt it was worth it for the sake of the few occasions when it was both.
Isn't that wonderful?
That's exactly it.
So, true story. I mean, you talk about Douglas's lateral thinking. True story, which I heard Jane, his wife, tell, still after he died, is that he would navigate himself. He had a terrible sense of direction. This having been in car rides with him, this I can attest to. But this was so terrible that he lived in Angel, lives in Islington, but he would navigate, whenever he had to go somewhere he didn't know how to get to, he would go to St. John's Wood first. Because he used to live in St. John's Wood and had sort of learned to navigate London from St. John's Wood. So his default was just to go there and then figure out where he was going. Sanj, that's brilliant. That's been really lovely. Thank you. Here is my conversation with Robbie Stamp. Robbie, as he will describe, was Douglas's business partner for the last decade of his life. He ran the Digital Village as CEO, and then went on, after Douglas's death, to produce the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie. Robbie is also one of my closest friends. Douglas introduced me to him nearly 30 years ago now, and since that time, we've been friends, colleagues, ever since. To give you some idea, Robbie's mother, Gillian Stamp, is the woman I call my grandmother. Our conversation reminded me of our huge shared past and the similar journeys we have taken weaving around the Addamsverse. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did.
I've chosen this particular quotation because I think it sits at the heart of so much of what deeply interests me about Douglas and his thinking. This is rather as if you imagine a puddle waking up one morning and thinking, this is an interesting world I find myself in, an interesting hole I find myself in. Fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly well, must have been made to have me in it. This is such a powerful idea that as the sun rises in the sky and the air heats up, and as gradually the puddle gets smaller and smaller, frantically hanging on to the notion that everything's going to be all right because the world was meant to have him in it, was built to have him in it. So the moment he disappears catches him rather by surprise. I think this may be something we need to be on the watch out for. And that's Douglas Adams quoted from The Salmon of Doubt, Hitchhiking the Galaxy, one last time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robbie. That was really lovely to hear. It's also one of my favorite pieces of Douglas. So let's start. Could you tell us who you are and how you met and how you knew Douglas?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for involving me. I'm really, really thrilled to be involved. Hi, I'm Robbie Stamp, and I was very lucky enough to be both a business partner and a close personal friend to Douglas Adams. We met in the early 90s. When I was working as a television researcher, making predominantly history and environmental documentaries. And I was also working in a little department called Special Projects, which was very interested in what was very daringly then called new media. And somebody who wanted to work with us at the department had managed to secure a meeting with Douglas where he hoped that Douglas was going to help him to finish a movie script that he was working on. As I got to know Douglas very well in the subsequent years, I was never, ever going to happen. But thankfully, very sweetly, this very nice man, Paul Springer, took me along to the meeting with Douglas in his house in Islington. And that was where we first met. And he talked about music and mathematics. We talked about Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, a book which seems very much to have fallen out of fashion, but I've been using as a sort of thought experiment around a lot of work with AI recently. And we just got on very well. And I invited him out to lunch. He invited me to his 40th birthday party. Subsequently, I was also coming really to the close of what I was wanting to do at Central Television, where I'd been working as a producer. I'd written, unbidden, a business plan called Cable City, which was a recognition that to take advantage of new cable and satellite opportunities, you needed to create an entirely new cost base for programming. You couldn't do it out of the cost base of a big traditional ITV television company in the UK. So I asked a finance director to teach me how to create a business model, a business plan, and I created Cable City. And I was telling Douglas about it, and it had morphed by then into something called the Digital Village. The Marshall McLuhan quote influenced that, the Digital Village. And I was sitting there with Douglas, several of our meetings in his house, and he said, oh, that sounds interesting. I'd like to be your partner. How much would it cost me to invest? So I plucked a figure out of the air, and he said, I'm in. And that was it. We were then 50-50 partners in this wonderful, one of the best adventures of my working life called the Digital Village. And that's how we met. Spool forward a number of years, we launched that in 1995. I can hand on heart genuinely say I became not just a business partner, but I think one of his closest friends as well, and certainly one of his closest friends at the time of his very, very untimely and far, far too early death.
One of the things that strikes me in doing these interviews and in diving into Douglas's life is how many of his subsequent close friendships came out of almost chance meetings, whether it's, Neil Gaiman knocking on his door to interview him for Penthouse magazine when Neil was 21, or, Lenny Henry living around the corner, or Angus Deaton living next door. Do you think Douglas was someone with a talent for friendship?
What a good question. Yes, I think he was. He had a wonderful capacity for friendship. As an example of that, the night before he died, I was speaking to him because my father had died that day. And Douglas had been incredibly kind and solicitous and thoughtful and in touch during that week period where my father got pneumonia and kind of made his way higher and higher up the hospital until he was in intensive care and died. And I remember going home and talking to Douglas, and it was everything that in very famous people maybe gets overlooked. There was a capacity just for a deep human friendship. It wasn't the famous person. It was just Douglas being solicitous. My mother-in-law would come down to look after the children because Sue was spending a lot of time with me at the hospital as well. And he spoke to my mother-in-law for 20 minutes, which, you know, he'd never met my mother-in-law, and you know, they wouldn't necessarily have had a huge amount in common. But he was so kind and so thoughtful. So yes, I think he had a great capacity for friendship. I'd call that a capacity rather than talent, a great capacity for friendship. But I think friendships are complicated sometimes when you get famous. And I think that there were friendships which were put under strain by the fame. And I think one of the things about my friendship with him was I'm not famous. I never have been, never will be. And so in a way, there was that element of competition was never there. But equally, he had some fabulous friendships with people who were very famous, maybe not quite as famous as he was at that stage, but certainly very famous. And so, yes, a wonderful capacity for friendship.
So many thoughts come to mind. The first is to say that that's certainly something you and he shared. You also have a great capacity for friendship. And I'm remembering, as you tell that story of him being on the phone with you and with your mother-in-law, I'm remembering that week. And of course, I remember your father dying. And I also remember that the way I found out about Douglas's death was you called me. You called and left an answer phone message. And putting aside the very Douglasness of hearing terrible news on an answer phone, which is feels a very gently moment to have. I remember thinking then, and I feel it again now, how generous that was of you. You were in all sorts of grief yourself, grief compounded, and you were making the time to call everybody and tell them. And, you know, let alone me, he wasn't, you know, he was an important figure in my life, but I was hardly an intimate friend. So belatedly, if I haven't said it before, thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It was an astonishing patch. I mean, it really was, because in terms of loss, because just a year before that, a very, very close friend had died of cancer on her 40th birthday. At the same time that the company Douglas and I built together, which was really going somewhere with the Earth edition of the guide, h2g2.com, we got run over by the collapse in internet stocks in 2000. And I went from chairing meetings with bankers and lawyers at tables long enough to have a different weather system at the far end, to dealing with bailiffs in the office. And it was a brutal experience. It really was. So there'd been a year of two very different kinds of loss, a very personal loss, and then a business loss, and sort of seeing a lot of hopes and dreams of a lot of people dashed. And it was very tough. And then just a year later, the following May, my father dying and Douglas dying. And certainly what was there, obviously a private moment of grief. I have a family I have 4 stepsisters from my father's first marriage. So there was work to be done as the eldest son of the second marriage, with sisters and organizing and so on. But then Douglas dying, and it was Ed Victor who called me to say Douglas had died half an hour ago in the gym. And then it was very public, and there were lots of phone calls to make and lots of people, and I was fielding lots of things. But there were key people who I felt, like you, would want to know, and I probably left a message on an answering machine because I couldn't get you directly, as you say. I think very bad news on answering machines is not ideal. But I'd wanted, I think also, if I'm honest, I probably wanted, if one thinks back to those kind of moments, you're wanting to reach out and share some of that moment.
Grief is like any extreme emotion. You want to be with the few people who will understand it.
Yeah.
Who will understand it in the way you are feeling it.
Yeah.
And to be able to reach out across the internet or across the phone to do that is
so it was, you know, I flew out then for his funeral in Santa Barbara, was there for that, a relatively small affair, and then back for my dad's funeral, and then was honoured to have spoken, given one of the eulogies at the much bigger memorial service in St Martin's in the Fields in central London some months later. It was a patch and a half, it really was.
Yes, gosh, yes. It's bringing back a lot, because of course that year, and if I remember correctly, the memorial was the week after 9/11. In fact, it was the first flying day after 9/11.
Gosh, yes. And there
were people around the world, I think, who couldn't come to it because flights had only just resumed. I remember not coming to it for a much stupider reason, which was I didn't realize it was a big public memorial. I thought it was a more private family event, and so I didn't come. I watched it. Here's an interesting thing. So you will probably remember that I wrote the original Dirk Gently play with an old friend, James Goss, and James has gone on to also live very deeply in Douglas's worlds. He adapted all the Doctor Who scripts into the novels, which all became bestsellers. But on that day, James's job was he worked for BBC Cult, running their online Doctor Who and Buffy and other web presence. And he was given the job of live streaming Douglas's memorial. And so, like me, he had met Douglas when we were 18 at Oxford, and here he was a decade later live streaming his memorial. So I watched it from my office, and I remember weeping. And like you, a year later than you, my .com had also melted down.
Yes.
And I had bailiffs in my office taking away furniture. And I was in this, and we had this huge, big empty loft in Shoreditch Roundabout. And it wasn't empty, it used to be full of talented young people making cool stuff. But I was there with all the furniture being taken away, watching at my desk, which is actually this desk. I still have the desk because they were custom built for us.
You know, it's funny that the two founders having that experience, because I remember reading a book very, very early on in the Digital Village journey when the founder was talking about kind of being the last person left in the office with the packing cases and the things around them. And I had the same experience with the Digital Village. I was kind of the last person to close the door. And oh my goodness, that experience of, you know, we talk a lot about, of course, and venture capital and all those things are about the winners. But we know that, you know, a lot of times things don't work. And sometimes it's because you maybe didn't execute and you didn't do this. But a lot of times there is an element of luck and there's an element of timing. And maybe, you know, that period that we were both in, you know, there were so many people rushing towards castle funding. And if you got your funding before the drawbridge went up, you might have been in the castle and you'd been all right. But for anybody who hadn't, you were, you know, going to be picked off one by the wolves in the forest, and you'd had it. So there's that element of luck and that element of that experience. But I really share that moment. I remember being in our offices in Maiden Lane where Douglas had an office, and I say so many brilliant young people. I wasn't that old myself at that stage, with so much, and it was one heck of a ride. But yeah, empty boxes, the ghosts of the enterprise. And thankfully, though, we've been able to pass some of the baton to the BBC.
Yes. Well, I remember those offices very fondly. And you'll be pleased to know I'm going to speak to Sophie for the book as well as to Ian. So there'll be some good Digital Village representation.
Oh, goodness. Yes, well, that will be interesting. You'll get different views.
So let's talk about Douglas's experience of that time. Because I certainly remember. So I met Douglas in like 94, late 94. So the company had started. I guess you were gearing up to launch. I remember him telling me with great excitement that he had started this business and that he had, you know, these collaborators. And I think he said to me something like, it's like a very mini, tiny British version of DreamWorks. I don't know in his mind who was Spielberg, who was Katzenberg, and who was Geffen.
Yeah, they were heady days. I think there were so many aspects of it for Douglas. I think Douglas, it's an interesting duality. I mean, Douglas was a very, as we both know, very sociable person. He liked company. He was a phenomenally good conversationalist, wasn't he? I mean, he just, you know, he could talk on so many different subjects, was interested in so many things. He wasn't averse to gossip, but he was just an immensely good companion. And the loneliness, I think, of writing. So once the book had become so successful, which was the thing that really brought in the money, what do? You write another book. But the solitariness of writing books, I think in some ways didn't best suit his personality. So I think what the Digital Village gave him was some very, very smart young people. We were able to attract some really brilliant young people to come and work on the various projects we were working on. I think only one person interviewed for the company because they thought the company had been founded by Richard Adams, the author of The Warship Down. Everybody knew that Douglas was there, and actually that young man turned out to be a brilliant young game designer, and it was great. But yes, Douglas, he liked the company, actually. He just liked the company, and he liked working on teams. But he was primus inter pares. I mean, Douglas was a primary creative person. So I'd made the mistake early on of thinking he might want some help writing some of the scripts around a game called Starship Titanic we were doing, which was in fact the first big project that we got the funding for. And this was, I won't name it, wouldn't be fair, but it was a brilliant young writer. But that was never going to work. Douglas was going to need to be at the apex of the pyramid, and people were going to need to support that creative vision. He's a primary creative person, and in that sense, he doesn't really do that form of collaboration. But collaborating with the designers, the artists, the programmers, I think he absolutely loved. And back then, he would be working with his friend, for whom things really got very difficult for various reasons, which I may or may not go into, but with Michael Bywater. And the roaring of laughter would come out of Douglas's office, and they'd made another joke together, and they were roaring with laughter, and he got on really well with Neil Richards, who also wrote. So Douglas just liked the company. He liked having somewhere to go as well, I think, after years of solitariness in a way, which didn't absolutely suit his personality.
There's a really interesting dichotomy there, because on the one hand, he started off essentially wanting to be a Python, wanting to be an actor, a performer, writer, as part of a troupe. He got close to being a Python through his collaborations with them. But as he famously put it, he realized the part of John Cleese was already being played by John Cleese. And the time with them ended. But then the collaboration on the Hitchhiker's radio show, again, that was very deep collaboration with that group of people. But then when the book comes along, when the opportunity for the book comes along, and this is a matter of record, that the original idea was that he and John Lloyd should write it together, and he famously decided against it and wrote John a Dear John letter saying, no, you're not part of this anymore, and that obviously put a strain on their friendship for a while. But then he seemed to spend the next 20 years regretting that he had to write books by himself. So there's this strange... as you say,
I think he enjoyed the chat, he enjoyed the conversations, he enjoyed that. So as you're right, he was having to hold those two. And of course, when it came to writing, I mean, he was an immense stylist as well. I mean, he was somebody who labored over every sentence. It was not I'm just going to get 5,000 words written today, or, I'm somebody who needs to write 1,000 words a day or whatever it is. I mean, every sentence. And he would, when it got difficult, he'd like people to be in the room with him so he could read lines out. His sister, little Jane, would very often, be an audience for him, somebody to test things off. So he took the craft of writing immensely seriously. Great stylists like P.G. Wodehouse were enormous influences on him, and every word, every sentence, very, very carefully crafted and very thought about. So in that sense, that kind of loneliness of the long distance author, that was a component. And I think that when you have as big a success as you do, as he did with Hitchhikers, and I'm sure, be the only person to tell the story of, heading off to, I think it was called Forbidden Planet, a famous comic book store in London, in a black taxi cab, and the black cab going, Governor, I can't get you any closer. There's something big going on. And he gets out and he, covers the rest on foot. And the big thing that's going on, the enormous queues waiting for him for his autograph. And he said that, to me anyway, that was the moment, and maybe others, that was the moment where he felt his life change. It was that moment of, oh my goodness, the traffic jams, the black cab can't get there because of something I've done. And I think that when that happens to you in your mid-20s, and then, of course, the pressure is the next one and the one after that and the one after that and the one after that and then the last one. And I think by book 5, it was really difficult. You're making a lot of money. It's the thing, and it's got this centrifugal force, and it's quite hard to escape its grip. And I think that was another thing that the Digital Village gave him. Here was another space where a lot of his other creativity, his other ideas could breathe, could be brought to life. There were so many things that we wanted to go on and do together at the company, founded on the idea of the internet changing everything in terms of the way people were going to be able to relate to brands. We called ourselves, what again sounds very quaintly now, a multiple media company. But I think we both had that vision that whatever you were doing, book, film, TV, game, the internet was going to give you the chance to relate to people who loved what you were doing in a way that just hadn't been possible before, because you were the gatekeeper and you were able to open it up yourself. You didn't have to go through one of the traditional publishing or TV or feature film gatekeepers. So I think the Digital Village opened up the possibility of his creativity again. And it was just fun. And it wasn't all about that centrifugal force of the books in particular.
So let's talk about the internet then, because it seemed to me then, and it seems even more clear with the benefit of the distance, that Douglas got the internet intuitively and early. I think he told me he had an email address in the 80s, which is well before most people knew what email was. You're talking, scientists and military and a handful of hardcore technologists, and Douglas had the internet, and he famously bought the first Mac in the UK, and Stephen Fry got the second.
Stephen finally conceded that.
Well, I'll ask him next week. Ask him next week. Let's talk about that. Why do you think? I mean, he's an author. He read English at Cambridge. He wanted to be a comedian. What in his personality or his interest set took him to technology and took him to the internet? And in your early meetings with him when you were talking about this company, why was he thinking about it so profoundly?
I think there's a clue in the shirt you're wearing. Everything is connected. I think that deep, quite where this wellspring was, that deep sense at his core, I think so much of what he explores creatively through almost all of his work is that idea. Everything is connected and everything is perspectival. And I think he saw in the internet an emergent technology which was going to sort of in a way make flesh that interconnectedness of things. It were millions and millions and millions of nodes which were going to be connecting in new ways, some of which we could maybe predict and many we couldn't. And I think he found that emergent property intellectually hugely exciting, because I think it was an enormous river flowing into his creativity, which was maybe one of the most important well springs in my mind, was that natural fascination in perspective and in connectivity. And I think that the internet was there. He just saw it very, very, very early on as this massive playground where so much was going to be possible that hadn't been possible going through traditional gatekeepers. And I'm sure somebody else will choose the reading of the river rules, and what would the Nile, the Mississippi, etc. say it's like to hit the sea. And he says, all you can really tell them is river rules will no longer apply. But I think Douglas, when I look back to those early conversations, was phenomenally prescient about an awful lot of the ways in which the internet duly has evolved. I think maybe this is for another part of the conversation, but I think maybe some of the wilder, nastier aspects, or the more difficult aspects of what we've learned about social media and the internet, he kind of died before we'd really seen a lot of that. And I think before the internet found its business model, which was turning human beings into financial derivative products who are sliced, diced, and sold and resold and sold in these massive advertising trading markets. So I think he was there in the early optimistic, more wide-eyed days of what was going to be possible. But I think it was that freedom and that recognition of the interconnectedness of everything that thrilled him.
That makes a lot of sense. I might argue that whether or not he knew it fully consciously, or whether it became part of your business discussions, that the guide as described in the books, certainly by the time you get to book 5, is the untrammeled problem of a so-called democratic but corporate internet. By book 5, the guide becomes the property of a dangerous corporation. And I think Douglas was always very clear-sighted about the cruelty of capitalism.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think you know the books themselves better than I do, and I think that is very fair. And of course, a lot of that book he wrote with Michael Bywater. I mean, Michael Bywater they wrote a lot of that book together, and it was a much darker time for various reasons in Douglas's life. That whole being embezzled by his accountant, the area of things had made that time in his life very difficult. And I think, but you're right. I mean, it's interesting when you talk about capitalism, because I don't remember having very many political conversations with Douglas. It wasn't an area. I mean, I could probably guess at what his politics were. I mean, he wouldn't have been having Nigel Farage round to supper, but he is. I can get. They were broadly centre left, but he wasn't in that sense huge. It was environmental issues, thinking issues, philosophical issues, humour. Those were the things that really drove him. So it wasn't that he wasn't interested in politics, but I certainly, in my relationship, maybe there were others where there was more politics. So the capitalism piece, I think, is really, really interesting. And indeed, for another conversation, another time, as you know, it's a lot of what I'm trying to think about with the rights that I still hold in the guide itself, which is now looking at, okay, well, what have we learned after 25 years of social media? How can we put those rights into new kinds of structures? Looking at what the response to late 19th century capitalism in terms of land societies and building societies, mutual societies, which have different forms of structure and financial incentive in them, as the only way you've got a shot at going up against entrenched existing capitalist structures. That, I think, is a really interesting challenge. And there's a big movement beginning to grow with some of the founding fathers of the internet, people like Vint Cerf and Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Shadbold. I was talking about it with Audrey Tang, who was until recently the digital affairs minister in Taiwan, about the rewilding of the internet, sort of what looking at some of the original species that were there. And Audrey had long been a Hitchhiker fan, and I can tell that story in a second if you like. But she said she was looking around for the original species, so many of which have gone extinct. But H2G2, clinging on by its fingertips, held together by love and sticking plaster, is an original species, and potentially, rather like the very famous George Monbiot, what happens when you put wolves into Yellowstone Park and you get this reflowering of so many different species. There's a movement to go, can we go back to some of that wild-eyed optimism there, but with very careful about ownership structures of the kind that Douglas was giving us a warning about in Book 5.
I think that's incredibly interesting. Yeah, the guide starts off as this optimistic, freewheeling, every researcher has a point of view, can upload what they want system. But then gradually you see the problems of no fact checking. There's a wonderful bit that, the guide is accurate, reality may be faulty. And you start to see what goes wrong. I mean, the Earth gets blown up in part because of inaccurate information in the guide. And by Book 5, it is controlled by corporate interests who simply want to maximize profit and, reality be damned. And I'd love maybe to hear about Audrey, and maybe I'd love to talk to her. One of the other people I want to talk about politics is, Ed Miliband says that Hitchhikers is one of his favorite books, or his favorite book. And so I'm going to try and talk to Ed about it now that he's, particularly interesting now that he's back in government.
I think it's a really, really interesting reminder for me there, actually, but with some of the thinking I'm doing at the moment about those things that Douglas foresaw and what happens when you end up with a certain kind of financial model and incentive model driving, and all those governance issues which crowd into the space, and how you have governance structures whereby you are deciding what's in and what's out. And we've got the example of X, formerly Twitter at the moment, astonishingly large. I mean, just in the last, whatever it is, 24, 48 hours. So, and of course, that is a big irony, and how much I want to get quoted on this. Elon Musk, one of the biggest famous Hitchhiker fans on the planet. And I think, I had a lot of people when Grok came out and he was talking about doing Hitchhiker stuff, saying, Robbie, does he own the rights to do that? And it's arguable that he really doesn't, and that if anybody does, I do. He didn't bother to ask the family. He didn't bother to be in touch with anybody. Just because he's Elon Musk, he went ahead and did it. But it was awful. I mean, Douglas would have hated the quality of what Douglas is phenomenally hard to pastiche. And one of the things when we set out to create the guide, the H2G2 guide, Douglas wanted it to have practical utility. He wanted it to be a real guide, a guide to life, the universe, and everything, but a guide that had utility. And he didn't want endless pastiches of Arcturian mega tigers, and he didn't want that. And when we started to get that at the top, we nipped it in the bud very fast because we were very aware of what DNA, Douglas Noel Adams DNA, is always very proud of that association, that he wanted to have. He wanted it to have real world utility. And I think that one of the things we managed to do with the guide, and I say now it's on a forgotten part of a forgotten planet in a forgotten solar system, etc., in an unregarded part of an unremarkable galaxy, but we are not locked into toxic data and business models. And we did, even in that when we launched, we were contemporary with Google, and if we had an article, we were on the front page of Google. So, in those early heady days, we were on the way to becoming one of the biggest social media generated businesses around. And we worked really hard on what the overall tone was. And it was a place where, and to this day, it's a place where, as I've written this little manifesto for it, is, this is not a place for you if you're not a person who can ever admit that you're wrong. If you can never admit you're wrong, you will hate this place, because this is for people who have things are uncertain, things you don't know, things you may be wrong. If you're never willing to admit you're wrong, and Douglas has got great quotes about that, and there are some opinions that really are worth a great deal more than others. So one of the manifesto things is you're not entitled to your opinion. Opinions aren't an entitlement; they need to be earned. And this idea that anybody should ever finish an argument with, well, that's my opinion and I'm entitled to it, was absolute anathema to Douglas. That he did not think that. Philosophically, he thought that was dangerous. And I think, as you say, he foresaw some of the hideousness that can happen when those things just grow like a cancer. And I think by the time the social media companies were getting to grips with it, it was too late, because they've been doing it's just a humble platform, move along, nothing to see here. And to be fair to the likes of Facebook, the time between launching Facebook, maybe as a rather misogynist project at Harvard, but to its coming into its, and then being, in front of congressional committees of being accused of subverting, undermining Western democracy, was an incredibly short period of time. But by the time people were doing, they were just a platform for which, of course, they'd all lobbied very hard as well. So we're not responsible for what goes on the network. And then it was clear you had to be. But by that stage, that particular genie was out of the bottle.
I think there's something very interesting that we're circling here, which is that all companies are to some extent a reflection or a manifestation of their founders' personalities and philosophies. And I think particularly social media companies. We've seen how Twitter, which started as this gloriously benign and cheerful tea party with all your most famous friends, I remember it in its first year. I remember it, at the time when Stephen Fry, Douglas's great friend, was the most followed person on the planet on Twitter. And at that point, it felt like Stephen Fry's tea party. It felt like you could go on and have a lovely chat about anything and learn and be educated. And we've seen it, and indeed, its founders, Jack Dorsey and co., however perhaps flawed in the running of a large-scale business, were young, idealistic chaps who wanted to make something fun and positive. And to see it morph and distort under Mr. Musk's, let's call it loosely, leadership, to its apogee last night, in his 2-hour diatribe with Mr. Trump, which, fun aside, apparently, and I did not listen to the whole thing, I don't think very many people did, certainly not the 8 million he was hoping for after it crashed in its first seconds. But apparently one of the things they said on it was that they agreed heartily with each other that striking workers should be fired, which of course in the US goes against federal law. And so there is, as of this morning, several unions looking to file charges against them for that chat. So that's fun.
And it's funny, I had this, again, this is probably not for quoting particularly, but, I've had this thought recently, supposing Elon Musk were to get wind of the fact that there are these rights out there somewhere. And there's one day, there's a phone call, my phone goes, and it's, hey, it's Elon here. And somebody's joking. And he says, I want to buy your rights. Would I sell them? And I hope genuinely actually, the answer is no, because the one thing that even Elon Musk, for all of that power, doesn't have, he doesn't have the thing that Douglas started. And he didn't know Douglas. And he didn't, and I did. And lots of the people who worked with me did. And I was, obviously unique in that, but I did know Douglas, and I came to know Douglas well. So the one thing I have is this is the thing that Douglas himself started. This is the spark. And somehow we've managed to kindle it and keep it going all this time. And maybe now, where we've seen everything that's gone over the last 25 years, precisely because it isn't run by an Elon Musk, it's in the hands of, somebody in a small group who actually want it to be itself, want it to have all the snark and the fun, the guide and the irreverence of the guide, that original wilder, more anarchic guide, that don't panic, that counterposition to the Encyclopedia Galactica, all of that stuff. That's its essence, and how we help that essence to grow. And I think that it's, that whole model we were talking about earlier about subscription internet. Now, it may be that means that you'll always stay small. Maybe there'll only ever be 1,000 people who would want to pay £42 a year to be a member of the guide and help it to grow and develop, in which case you go at the pace that £42,000 a year gives you. But if you found that you got it right, and you created a new kind of state, a new kind of space under this 42.0 umbrella, you could have a lot more people. And I think that would thrill Douglas, because I think then you'd be able to explore some of the other issues technologically that he was fascinated in. I'll give just one example of in the Starship Titanic game that we made together, where sadly we were never able to do the part of the game that Douglas wanted to do, which was how the data side of the ship. So we had the matter side of the ship, as he called it, and he wanted something which was a whole different visual representation of the data side of the ship. And I think there's a fascinating, and I'd like the guide to be a part of a sandpit for the next three-dimensional generation of how we interact with data and data space, what it means for us as individuals to be held in ones and zeros, for states, cities, how we start to navigate, how we guide ourselves around these new places. I think Douglas would have gone, yeah, absolutely, because he was so interested in interfaces. Douglas was fascinated by interfaces. Alan Kay, of course, was, the creator of the mouse and things, was a great buddy and friend of his. So a lot of those rank Xerox part early people Douglas was friends with. Interfaces to data, and indeed, if you like, interfaces to the everything is connected, fascinated him. So we were able to do one kind of classic 2D interface, but now what I've got in mind for what I would like to be doing next, I think he'd have loved that. He'd have loved the philosophy, the technology, the data, sound as well, starting to navigate data through sound, through haptics. All those things I think would have really thrilled Douglas. And I feel it's one of the big things I want to do with the next decade of my life is to try and set this thing off on a new direction, looked after by a next generation of leadership in a completely different structure, where you might think kind of it's all over, the big social media companies have done everything there is to know. There's so much more that we could do. And that spirit of Douglas still, very much infuses everything there was at the guide. And I'm hopefully can still be an enabler for that next stage of what we might do.
No, I would love to see that happen and to help that happen. You said to me in our emails before today that we'd love to talk about Douglas as a philosopher, or Douglas's philosophy. Tell me what you meant by that, and let's explore that a little bit together.
Well, one of the reasons for choosing the parable of the puddle, and Douglas will have to forgive me for calling it a parable because, of course, he was a militant atheist, so I'm not unaware of the irony of talking about the parable of the puddle. It seems to me that the reason I chose it, because I think it goes to the heart of Douglas's worldview, or at least one of his worldviews, if you can have many, but one of his worldviews, which is that him saying on record as well that the whole import of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is that every species in the galaxy feels they're more central to the story than they are. And I think that is I'm in fact, I was just talking to a publisher today about a book which I hope they want to take from me, which is going to be called The Puddle and Radical Humility. And this idea of radical humility, of having a much greater creative sense by understanding how perspectival everything is, that there's no there. In that sense, I don't think Douglas was a metaphysician. I think he was a phenomenologist. I think he was deeply interested in the nature of experience and how people and different species, what if there was a super intelligent shade of blue, thinking about a rhinoceros with their phenomenal sense of smell, seeing in some form of three-dimensional time. What is it to be a rhinoceros brain, an embodied rhinoceros? You are smelling the decay rates of various kinds of smells to give you a sense of what needs to be paid attention to and not, with appallingly bad eyesight, as he says in Last Chance to See. But that he was fascinated in that what if. You think the world looks like this, but if I put a camera down here, doesn't it look like this? And he just had an endless genius on riffing on that. So an idea like Babelfish, for example. So he grows up watching science fiction, wondering why aliens always speak English. When he comes to write, he needs a narrative device to explain that. Now, a lot of writers would have just done some kind of computer gizmo which translates for you in your ear, which is kind of where we are heading to now already with AI. And so, no, Douglas chose a fish. Douglas created the Babelfish, which fed on brainwaves. Now, that was Douglas's genius about perspective. So I think the philosopher in Douglas is this phenomenologist, endlessly willing to explore perspective and relationality, not with the sense that there is a there, an ultimate reality, but that there is any number of potential ways of seeing and perceiving the universe from an atomic level, from a rhinoceros level, from a super intelligent chamber view, any number of different ways of seeing perspective. So that's why I think he was a philosopher deeply interested in the nature of experience and how we experience our universe.
Makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. As you say, it's in all the writing. And it's, of course, most on the surface in his conservation work. You talk about the rhinoceros and the extraordinary thing he achieves in his writing in Last Chance to See, which he always described as his favorite of his books.
Yeah, yeah.
Is his ability to get into the mind of these animals, of a rhinoceros, of a sloth, of the kakapoo. And I was reminded in rereading that, the thing that came to mind, the only other person, the only other sort of celebrity I've seen do that is Robin Williams. And there's some amazing footage of Robin Williams swimming with dolphins and talking to them. And of course, Robin was this amazing mimic, and he could do any accent and mimic anybody else. Then you see him mimicking the dolphins back at them. And you see the dolphin sort of go, oh, you speak dolphin. You speak it badly and with a terrible accent, but you are saying the words. And it seemed to me Douglas did a sort of writing thought version of that he could, write what it might maybe feel like. These, as you say, these insoluble mysteries. What does my cat think? And Douglas could sort of think his way into probably not the answer, but a answer, or at least a way of thinking that was so not solipsistic, that was so not like the puddle.
Well, not solipsistic. And so, here's another great quote, obviously a very famous one from the guide about dolphins. For instance, on the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he had achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on. Whilst all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water, having a good time. But conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were far more intelligent than man for precisely the same reasons. So, you've absolutely gone to the heart of that playfulness. Man, the third most intelligent. We've got the mice as well to play around with. And it's something I think about a lot with the thinking I do around AI as well, where we talk about we mustn't anthropomorphize things. I've been wondering whether you can turn that on its head and say, yeah, anthropomorphization is a sin, but it's differently conceived as a sin of hubris, because actually to suggest we are the only creature capable of, or the only ontology capable of certain kinds of feelings, emotions, ways of being in the world, and that we sit at the top of some kind of scala naturae, that itself is a great sin. So we say we mustn't anthropomorphize this. And actually, in fact, that's sinful, because it's back to that verse 27, chapter 1, Genesis, God saying to Adam, the world's yours, my son. Have dominion over fish and fowl and all the things in the world over it. I am making you this apex creature. And I think that morally, politically, philosophically, which is one of these ideas around this idea of radical humility, is how we both celebrate ourselves as a species at our most creative and constructive and get over ourselves at the same time. And I think an awful lot of Hitchhikers is about exactly that. It's Douglas's willingness to celebrate us at our most creative and our wildest and so on. But also it is a permanent message. I've only just had this thought. It's from a whole other world away. It's like the person in the Charioteer riding next to the Roman emperor saying, remember you're mortal, remember you're mortal, remember you're mortal. And Douglas is doing, remember you are not necessarily at the center of things in the way you think you are. And that's it. I think it's there with the relationality in Dirk Gently. It's there certainly in Hitchhikers. It's there in Last Chance to See. It's there in so many of his factual writings that, yeah, just beware of that hubris.
Musk could use Douglas at his elbow, one imagines. Although
he could, because the idea of radical humility and Elon Musk don't naturally sit together.
There's something that came out of what you just said when you talked about his factual writings. And it seemed to me that in his last years, and particularly in the Digital Village years, he was doing a lot more of that. I think he had a regular column in The Independent.
And Wired at some stage, I think, as well.
And Wired. And I actually loved that writing because you see him the way that he hadn't before publicly. He had always done it privately, but you see a sort of public intellectual starting to take shape. You see someone who was wanting to shape the way explicitly, not implicitly as he did through his fiction, but maybe Last Chance to See sort of took him on a trajectory, and the technology and work he was doing with you at the Digital Village sort of gave him a greater preparedness. I mean, to be honest, it's not that he ever needed he needed an excuse to talk. Douglas was always happy to pontificate on things, and it was always worthwhile because his pontificating was always brilliant and insightful and made you feel smarter. But there seemed to be something changing there, but maybe there would have been a new phase of Douglas Adams, the public intellectual, coming into focus. Do you think that was something he was conscious of?
I think that's very insightful. And in fact, recently I've done a number of panels. There was that book, The 42, The Wild and Improbable Ideas of Douglas Adams, that was published. And I did some panels. And on every panel, people wanting to ask the question, what did I think Douglas would be doing now or saying about such and such? So I think your insight that he was, in one sense, he had been on the public lecture circuit before he died. It was one of his main sources of income, as we know, in the latter stages of his life. But his writing was growing and developing, and I think he would have gone on to be, because he had that brilliant capacity for metaphor, for imagery, for giving you a story, an analogy which explained something complex. One of the first things we ever talked about was him wanting to do a big documentary series on evolution. And one of the last things we ever talked about was him wanting to do a big series about evolution. And I think he would have been a David Attenborough-like figure, potentially, for science and technology and ecology from a slightly different angle. But I think he was good enough. He was fabulous on camera. He was so good. He was so quick-witted. I think unquestionably one of the things, unquestionably, who knows? But I think very likely one of the things he would have gone on to do would have been growing that world, that writing, that exploratory part of him would, I think, have really, really, really grown. So, yes, I think that's a very good insight. And I think the answer is to yes.
My hope for this audiobook is it gets to do some of that work, that through all these conversations and we get to give his public intellectual side to a world that I suspect needs it more than ever. So we shall see.
What a great enterprise. And he just, I don't know, I mean, for both of us, he's been such an important figure in our lives for different reasons and similar reasons, and continues to be so. And I think of all the people I've known and worked with that I've been lucky to work with, I think he is probably the one who I feel was most genuinely the one that I've known touch with genius. I think there was something in that, little prep school boy who wrote an English essay, which was the only one that his English teacher ever gave 10 out of 10 for an essay. Growing up in that sense in very unremarkable circumstances, doing English literature at St. John's at Cambridge, and somehow making these incredible intellectual and imaginative jumps and leaps in his early 20s, which in some ways I think a lot of the rest of his intellectual life was spent filling in the gaps. There were things he kind of jumped into intuitively in those books. Before he'd done a lot of the reading about science and met a lot of the famous science people and people who then adored spending time with him, hanging out with him, drinking red wine and champagne and margaritas and having conversations late into the night. They were kind of filling in the gaps. And I remember, in the early days of Amazon, Douglas was very generous with sending people books. And so I'd get books dropping through my letterbox with titles like Why Do Elephants Have Big Ears, which I remember was one in particular, which was going to be about evolution. So that hunger for and interest in that burning curiosity. And I think, again, one of the great challenges, he says very grandly, that we have is, if you like, those worldviews which are about the autocratic worldviews, which are in the face of uncertainty and unknowability and fear and all the chaos that is around us as in our personal lives, our public lives, society's lives. We have a response, which is the autocratic one, which is build a wall, and I will make the uncertainty go away by finding the right people to hate. Whoever it is, immigrants, Jews, whoever the right people to blame. Set against that is the move towards uncertainty and complexity with humility. And Douglas stands for that. That's what Douglas stands for. Douglas stands for that burning passion inside to engage with connectedness and curiosity and being willing to think you were wrong. He always loved it when there were people from different disciplines who would say, no, you can't be right. If from my discipline as a geologist, you as somebody who thinks about the way the planet was formed, you can't both be right. And he loved that left field look. He loved mixing things up and having different disciplines. And I think it was just that innate hunger in him, politically, philosophically, morally. Everything we can do to strengthen those ways of being in the world are needed more than ever. And certainly as a man of my age, having made certain assumptions about modernity and progress being in lockstep, these last 5, 6, 7 years have been, it doesn't really matter what I'm feeling or not, but when you see it writ larger in the world, you can see that those assumptions, I was not prepared for the ferocity of the pushback, the obscurantist pushback from so many different sections of society in so many parts of the world. And how you engage creatively with uncertainty and interconnectivity, I think, is one of Douglas's greatest gifts, done with wit and fun and intelligence and imagination to the world of thought.
That's, I think, a beautiful place for us to end, Robbie, and also it would be a place for us to begin a whole other conversation. This is my interview with Sophie Astin. Sophie was Douglas's assistant for much of the last decade of his life, but she was so much more than that to him and he to her, as this interview will explain. Sophie's also an intensely private person, and this interview was an unusual case of her deciding to break that wall of privacy and talk openly about Douglas, who was a huge figure in her life. I've known Sophie since we were both in our early 20s together. She organized some of my earliest meetings, lunches, and dinners with Douglas. She was the gatekeeper when I wanted to get time on his schedule. I'm so glad that she made time for me, and glad that now we get to make time for her to tell her story here.
So this was the fax that Douglas sent to David Vogel, who was one of the executive producers at Disney. And Douglas was getting seriously frustrated at this point about the speed or lack of, at which things were going in terms of the movie. And Douglas once described it as cooking a steak by breathing on it, which pretty much sums up, how slow this whole process was taking. So he sent this fax to David on the 14th of April, 1999. And it goes like this. Dear David, I've tried to reach you by phone a couple of times. Perhaps it would have helped if I'd explained why I was calling. I was in the States for a few days and thought it might be helpful if I came across to LA so that you and I could have a meeting. I didn't hear from you, so I'm on a plane back to England where I'm typing this. We seem to have gotten to a place where the problems appear to loom larger than the opportunities. I don't know if I'm right in thinking this, but I have only silence to go on, which is always a poor source of information. It seems to me that we can either slip into the traditional stereotypes, you're the studio executive who has a million real-world problems to worry about, and I'm the writer who only cares about seeing his vision realised and hang the cost and consequences. Or we can recognise that we both share the same goal, which is to make the most successful movie we possibly can. The fact that we may have different perspectives on how this can best be achieved should be a fertile source of debate and iterative problem solving. It's not clear to me that a one-way traffic of written notes interspersed with long, dreadful silences is a good substitute for this. You have a great deal of experience nursing major motion pictures into existence. I have a great deal of experience of nursing The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy into existence in every medium other than motion pictures. I'm sure you must feel frustrated that I don't seem to understand the range of problems you have to contend with, just as I feel frustrated that I haven't had any real creative dialogue with Disney about this project yet. So I have a suggestion to make. Why don't we actually meet and have a chat? I could be in LA for next Monday or early the following week. I would invite Disney to bear the cost of this extra trip over. I've appended a list of numbers you can reach me on. If you manage not to reach me, I shall know you're trying not to. Very, very hard indeed. Best wishes, Douglas Adams. He then lists 31 phone and fax numbers, starting with me at the top as his assistant, with his email address, going through to the office fax number, the home fax, the UK cell phone, the US cell phone, his home in France, his wife, his film and book agents, producer of the movie, director's home and cell phones, going all the way through to Robbie's UK office and the cell phone numbers, his mother, his sister, his daughter's nanny, his next door neighbours, his favourite restaurants, and finally Sainsbury's, where they could page him. And I think that just about sums up Douglas in a nutshell. It was polite, it was hilarious, and it worked.
That's wonderful. And actually, my memory, and it's so hard sometimes figuring out what is a real memory and what is a construction. But my memory is that it did work, and I actually was in the building when it worked, and Douglas came out of his office sort of triumphant, saying Vogel has called, or Vogel's office has been in touch.
Exactly. So yeah, that was one of the favourites, I think, and that was discovered and published in the Salmon of Doubt, which of course I was part of after he died in 2001. So I'm Sophie Astin. I was introduced to the Digital Village in 1995 through a temping agency, an employment agency. I had come out of university and moved to London to seek my fortune. Started out in an advertising agency, realised that just was not for me, and started just sort of, reaching out and seeing, what opportunities there were out there. And this agency placed me with the Digital Village with a view to being Douglas's personal assistant and the sort of general office manager, if you like. I had no idea who he was. I thought I was applying for a job with Richard Adams, the Watership Down author. So, I'd never read the books. And I arrived. Did
you refresh your mind on Richard Adams before going in? Did you read up on rabbits?
I did. I read up on rabbits and all that kind of thing. But no, I was a bit surprised when it turned out not to be him or anything remotely close to that. So yeah, I got the job, and we were in Camden at that time. I guess you probably would have come to our offices there. We had a fabulous sort of top floor of this huge building in Bayham Street with a very light-filled, very cool, very, very, very 90s, sort of atmosphere, lots of creativity and kind of people working strange hours. We had a roof terrace. It was all very cool, and I loved it. And then we moved from there to Covent Garden, also a very cool office, right in the heart of Covent Garden in Maiden Lane. So that was sort of how I came to work with Douglas.
Amazing. Thank you. I remember our first meeting, your and my first meeting, probably in 96 or early 97. I think it probably would have been late 96. And it was in Camden, but it wasn't in the office. You met me in a sort of restaurant cafe a couple of blocks from the office. I can't remember what it was called. Delancey?
Oh, yes, that rings a bell.
Is there a bar in Camden called Delancey? That feels...
Yeah.
God, I probably haven't thought of
something
that
like that. That does ring a bell now, yeah.
And I remember feeling, I think you and I I graduated in 96, so we must be almost exactly the same age. And
sure.
So this was one of my first work meetings. And I remember thinking, oh gosh.
Why was it with me?
So let's start with, this letter that you read. It's such an extraordinary example of how the sort of public Douglas, the comic writer, sort of then gets seen in a private professional context where he's still being completely himself and bringing his own way of thinking about things. But instead of solving the destruction of the Earth, he's solving recalcitrant studio exec. Are there other, how much of that followed through? You sitting next to him for those years and watching him try to work through normal life. Are there other examples of how his sort of large brain and unique way of looking at the world just crashed up against normal life all the time and found new ways?
Yeah, so many people. In fact, even just this morning, I volunteer at my local library. I was co-facilitating a creative writing workshop, and I was telling them what I was going to be doing with you later on today, and they were like, so what was he really like? And I said, he was a massive procrastinator for sure. So, if you're asking me whether I actually saw him, doing, my role was really to corral him. My role was really just to sort of say, right, sit down and just do this for the next hour. This is what you need to be doing. You need to be telling me, when you need to be going, what keynote speak, of these opportunities you want to take, or can you sign some fan photos, or can you answer this email, or can you tell me this, that, and the other. He was very mercurial in that respect. He would be pulled in different directions by different people, admittedly, but also any opportunity to get stuck into a long conversation with somebody about tech or music or, something other than what he was supposed to be doing at that moment in time. So it made my job interesting and frustrating at the same time.
Were there things he massively preferred to do work-wise? Because it's interesting, there are writers who spend, and I'm one of these, who spend all their time defending their writing time. I try and keep everything else away so that I can write. My sense of Douglas is he was the exact opposite of that. And seemed to spend all his time inviting in distractions.
Oh gosh,
from actually...
yeah, exactly. And in the period of time that I was working with him, he didn't write a novel, right? there wasn't, a big body of work being worked on while I was there. So maybe that I didn't get to see, if you asked his assistant, 10, 15 years before me, if he had one, she might give you a very different story. But certainly, there are all these stories about him having to be locked in a hotel room to finish, books and so on. I think what he was really enjoying, and I think Robbie Stamp and Richard Harris and Richard Creasy would agree, he was such a a social being, a social animal, that actually what he was really enjoying in those last few years was working in an office environment with lots of interesting, young, creative, brilliant people on Starship Titanic, on H2G2. That's what fed him, the excitement to, he was in the office a lot of the time. He probably didn't need to be, but he really enjoyed spending time in our company, I think.
Yeah, he certainly always talked about it that way. It was like he had finally found a creative home, which is really interesting because he had opportunities over the years to collaborate. Famously, he and John Lloyd were meant to co-write the original Hitchhiker's book. And, he sort of put a bit of a ding in their friendship by saying no to that. And, that sort of thing happened a few times where he had a chance to, but it felt like the books had to be him and him alone. Right. But everything else he wanted to collaborate on, even though the books were the things that...
Yeah, and that's probably why I felt moderately uncomfortable being involved with Salmon of Doubt, because I just felt that, as a writer, I write now for a living as well, but, different kind of thing. You're so proprietorial over what you write and what you don't write and what you don't publish and what you don't show to other people. I just was, it's about like when an album is released posthumously and you're like, if it wasn't released previously, why would they want it out there now? On the other hand, maybe the body of work was so rich and so wonderful that it would have been criminal not to share it with the wider world.
It's always a judgment call, isn't it? But I think the good thing, look, most of Salmon of Doubt, other than the sort of unfinished chapters of Salmon of Doubt
Yeah.
The Dirk Gently unfinished fragment. Most of it was stuff that, there was interviews and essays and
for sure.
and all that is so great. And it's also interesting the stuff that, Kevin found in the archive and put into 42. I think it shows process. I think it shows process, and Douglas's process was interesting because he was such a perfectionist. The fact that he would revise everything endlessly and start
he would. And I think I've said it before that I used to go to some of his keynotes, speaking opportunities with him, and he would get really nervous. Actually, despite appearances, he would not just blithely walk on stage and just deliver something that was, sort of the same carbon copy of something that he'd done the previous week. He would, or if he did, he would make it sound very special to that particular audience. He would tweak just the odd little bit, and he just had a very clever way of delivering something that made you feel as the audience made you feel very special and very, very unique.
I agree. I was lucky to see a bunch of them in person and actually have been, because we've been digitizing his undigitized archive as part of this book. And the most useful stuff is that stuff. There's talks in Germany, there's talks to various tech conferences and mobile phone conferences. And most people dial it in for that stuff. Most celebrities, for corporate gigs, it's just take the check, trot out the greatest hits and go home. And he really didn't. You can see him working on new material. You can see him trying out new ideas. And, there's a brilliant joke he does to it. This one felt like he had probably done it more than once, but he did it it was in Cologne. And he says, it's very kind of you to all come out here to listen to someone speaking a foreign language. And even though I know a lot of you probably speak decent English, for those of you who don't, who are concerned, I've been looking at my remarks very closely, and I figure there's a big laugh about every 20 seconds. So if you just want to do that, we'll be fine.
Love it.
It's actually really interesting for me that you knew him, and I guess we both knew him, but you much closer during this period where he wasn't writing a book, and it was all the collaborations and the other projects. Because in a way, a sort of new Douglas seemed to be emerging, a Douglas sort of freed from the burden of being a novelist, and one who, maybe was going to turn into a sort of public intellectual and TV personality. And did you get a sense did he have a sense, other than his obsession with Hitchhikers the movie, did he have a sense of what he was aiming for? Was he aiming for anything, or was it just how much fun could he have in any given moment?
I think probably the fun bit was really important. I often wonder what he would be doing now. I'm sure we all do, and how, I don't know, technology. I just wonder how he would, first of all, have embraced it all. Secondly, whether he would be, every Friday night you turn on a chat show or a talk show, or whatever. Would it be Douglas sitting there? Did he love? Part of me sort of got the sense that he kind of loved talking and debating with people. Other things made him feel deeply uncomfortable, and live television was not his favourite thing to do, as I discovered. Not that he did a huge amount of television while I was working with him, but certainly around Starship Titanic, there were a few opportunities that obviously he was doing.
There's some story about him not having a great time on Have I Got News for You?
Yeah, that was before my time. We did BBC. We did the Big Do you remember the Big Breakfast?
Yes.
He was sort of like fish out of water at that point. But it was
yes,
all
I can't see that being his natural platform.
No.
Would have been Chris Evans and Denise Van Outen.
Denise Van Outen. Yeah, yes. Exactly. So yeah, I don't know really what I would see him doing now. What do you think? I mean,
I wonder whether he was beginning. He was writing this series of articles. I remember he had was it a weekly column in the Independent or somewhere that he would write about technology and about nature and whatever was on his mind. I could sort of see a sort of public intellectual emerging, a sort of an explainer, someone who would enjoy explaining the world.
Yeah. And I mean, he also loved travel, and he loved swanky hotels. So actually, put all of that together, he probably would have made a very enjoyable life just traveling the world and doing these keynote speeches that we've talked about, and done a very good job of it. So, yeah.
There's that. Did he do much of the... I know Last Chance to See was before you, but he was still doing sort of bits of nature travel in those last years. But speaking of, didn't he go to Australia and dive with stingrays at around in the late 90s sometime? I don't know.
He always said that was his favourite book, you know, and again, maybe that would be something else that he would have spent his years doing much more of, especially now with, you know, the environment being under so much threat. I think he would have had a really prominent voice there, actually, to talk about endangered species and the destruction of the planet. So, yeah, that could be something else that he would have definitely been involved in.
How much did he worry about stuff? Was he a big worrier about the world? Like you say, I mean, you know, he's famous for writing a series of books about the destruction of the planet, and he was clearly concerned with conservation, or at least became deeply concerned with animal conservation. You know, was he sort of conscious of the climate crisis? Was he worrying about mankind's future? Was he a worrier?
I probably never saw that, but I suspect if you ask other people, they probably would say that he was actually, and quite often, you know, his mood could sort of change, and he would worry on a more local level. I mean, he worried very much about the direction that the movie was going in. I mean, I know that caused him genuine anxiety, and as I said, he was a perfectionist. He suffered a little bit from not stage fright. He suffered from nerves for sure. So, you know, he didn't have that natural confidence that you probably think he did. But I don't know about sort of being kept awake at night about the environment. That was certainly not a conversation I ever had with him.
Knowing enough about his life, and indeed the life of any sort of high-powered celebrity creative, I'm sure every day was different. But was there a routine? Like, I'm interested, like, how did he work? Like, it's so hard to imagine him just sitting and responding to emails. It's hard to imagine him doing normal things. He was so big and seemed so different in every
He surrounded
setting.
himself with a lot of yellow legal pads. I know that. There were lots of scribblings. Quite what they were, I probably wouldn't even be able to tell you that. But he loved, as I said, because he was such a he was so easily distracted, and he would procrastinate. I think he would just be pulled in lots of different directions during the course of his day. I mean, a typical day, of course, when I was working for him, half the time was when he was living in London, and the second half was when he was living in Santa Barbara. And I was still living in London. For the most part, I would go over occasionally. But so that already created a bit of a difference in the way that we worked together because of the time difference. So typically, you know, a bit like you and I are now, you know, by the time I was sort of coming towards the middle of the afternoon for me in London, I would probably be the first person to call him, or I would be the first person that he would call, just to see what was on his plate for that day, what needed any sort of actioning. He would obviously still be doing a lot of travel at that point. So on a practical level, I was, you know, working with people to organise travel to get him off to a keynote speech in Sweden or Germany or Australia. There was fan mail to deal with. There were press inquiries to deal with. There was, you know, everything else in between, dealing with the charities that he supported, organising a photo shoot. I mean, I did everything other than the sort of family-based things. I didn't get involved in, you know, getting the car serviced and that kind of thing. But yeah, everything else was pretty much on my list.
There's always the joke that big brains are not always good at small stuff. How was Douglas on small stuff? Would he forever be
not great? Not great. That's why he had me, I think.
Would you get phone calls in the middle of the night going, "I've lost my passport, where's my wallet, I've missed my flight"? Were those the sort of eventualities of his life?
Yeah, I mean, he was a little bit of a you know, chaotic creative in that respect. And, you know, his desk was phenomenally untidy. So, yeah, it was kind of, as I said before, my role was to corral him and to just make sure that, and, you know, I'm a very list-based person. That's just the way that I am. I'm just kind of quite well organised like that. So I think we were a good, you know, you have to be with a job like that, right? So, yeah, making sure, you know, and then it was things like, again, as you would know, how many days out of the country have I had for tax reasons? I need to just keep a really close tally on things like that, which is quite boring, but somebody's got to do it. I think that where I helped was that I was not a Hitchhiker fan, and I didn't have those rose-tinted spectacles that maybe somebody else might. I think that would have been it would have muddied the waters, if you like, in the sort of role that I had. It was good that I was very objective and I could stand back and decide which sort of speaking opportunities were worth pursuing and which probably weren't. That sort of thing.
I mean, one of the other areas that I'm curious about spending some time on is music was obviously hugely important to him. And, the collection of left-handed guitars is legendary. Was that something he was spending more time on? There are also many, cassettes full of guitar riffs that we will not be reproducing in their full glory for this book. But
I don't think I ever saw. Personally, I don't think I ever saw him play the guitar. But he listened to music all the time in the car, in the whatever. He also, when he moved to Santa Barbara, discovered live music to some extent. Down in LA, he would go and see guitarists, in particular acoustic guitarists, performing. He'd buy their CD, let's put it in the car. He was quite, once he discovered an artist or an album that he liked, that would be on, repeat for quite some time. I never saw him. I saw his collection of guitars. I never saw him play. Interesting. Never thought about that, actually.
Anything that I haven't thought to ask? Any memories that you would particularly like to share? Or
I mean, there's the memory that, I think has become quite sort of fabled now, but which I do remember very clearly, which was when in 2000 when he was on holiday in Fiji, and he went on a boat trip around some sort of remote islands and suddenly realised that he had full mobile phone coverage. And he was so excited that he thought, I need to just test this out and call somebody. So, of course, he called me. And it was something like 4:00 in the morning in London. And he was, standing there kind of waist deep in water with his goggles on or whatever, calling me. And he discovered then, I'm sure you know the story, that the reason that the mobile phone coverage was so good was that he was near Castaway Island, which is where the movie Castaway was filmed, and Tom Hanks had put it into his, contract that obviously he needed mobile phone coverage during the filming, and had arranged to have a satellite installed so that he could phone his agent. So Douglas was absolutely delighted with that story, and then said that you needed to have it on the on Highway 1 in California because the mobile phone coverage there was so shocking. Again, as you probably know.
Amazing. I knew bits of that, but not all of it together. That is brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. How much of a presence is he in your life 25 years on, or 24 years on, whatever we are now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I remember, and this is a really sad memory, of course, but the day that he died, I remember it so clearly. It was genuinely a life-changing day, because for me it meant the end of, a friendship with this wonderful man, but also the end of my job, and it was kind of like, my God, what, first of all, it's just incredible that he had gone so suddenly. It was so shocking that I think it took a lot of us a long time to really sort of get over it, and to really realize that he had gone. And it was very, very surreal. I think partly because I had been with him the day before he died. I'd flown back to London. He died, and I had then jumped on a plane to go back over again. And everything was exactly as it had been the couple of days earlier. Do you know what I mean? So it felt just incomprehensible that he'd gone. And although I was working for the estate for about a year afterwards, the sort of, he wasn't there, so it was sort of felt a little bit meaningless, really. But yeah, I mean, I think about him. I think about him a lot, really. I can't believe it's 23 years since he died. Yeah. Just crazy. And like I said, I just feel that he would have embraced so much of what has happened in the world of technology and so on in the last 23 years that just, what a waste, really. he would have been so excited. He would have been like a kid, you know, exploring all this amazing tech that's come out, and probably quite frustrated by a lot of the direction it's gone in as well. But yeah, I would be fascinated to know what his rest of his life would have looked like had he lived longer.
What do you think would have frustrated him?
Well, same things that frustrate all of us, probably. Social media, probably. You know, maybe lack of privacy, being that he was in the public eye. Maybe that wasn't such a thing when he was alive. But now, you know, that's a worry, isn't it? But he would have loved, you know, books being available online and just, you know, everything downloadable at the click of a button, and sharing videos and photos and music and movies. And yeah, I think he would have been tickled by a lot of the stuff that we can do now. And of course, AI is a biggie.
Yeah, I mean, he saw AI coming. He wished for AI. He willed AI into existence. The amount of effort that went into the intelligent chat bots on Starship Titanic, and you know, he would be elated. We have the guide now. At last, it's here.
We do. Is it what he would have dreamt it to be, do you think?
I think in his darkest moments is where it's sadly going, although we could save it yet. I think, you know, in the fifth book, which he always said was his darkest book and was written at a low point in his life, and he would have liked to have written another one, that's where the AI goes rogue, right? That's where the guide goes rogue, and its new AI form actually does destroy the world. And that feels terrifyingly like what's actually happening right now. And in a way, there's a way of reading Hitchhikers as a parable about unchecked social media and unregulated internet in the hands of unregulated capitalism. You know, it all goes wrong when corporations buy the guide and monetize it. That's why Ford tries his best to bankrupt them. You know, so there is a sort of, you know, certainly Douglas, I think, was very clear-sighted. Even, you know, as much as he enjoyed money and success himself, I think he was very clear-sighted about corporations being amoral. You know, I think if nothing else, I think Disney taught him that. And,
yeah, for sure.
And so I think he saw that. But yes, I think he would have been, though, a corrective. His existence would have been a corrective. He would have railed against it and created, you know, one would hope, created little corners of the internet that were more amenable to happy fruits. So we'll see.
Exactly. Amen.
This video is my conversation with Lenny Henry. I'm going to let him introduce himself because he does it with a style and flair that none could equal. What I will say about Lenny is that he and Douglas had a very special bond. It was around them both being fathers of daughters and being big, huge creative forces. I didn't get to know Lenny well till quite recently. We met working on a TV show together, and since then, we've become close collaborators. In fact, I'm about to go into rehearsal on my adaptation of his children's book series, The Boy with Wings. He is an unusual and extraordinary force for good within the British entertainment industry, and his memories of Douglas are amongst the most personal and most heartfelt of all the people I interviewed for this book. Enjoy.
This is by Douglas Adams and is called For Children Only. You will need to know the difference between Friday and a fried egg. It's quite a simple difference, but an important one. Friday comes at the end of the week, whereas a fried egg comes out of a hen. Like most things, of course, it isn't quite that simple. The fried egg isn't properly a fried egg till it's been put in a frying pan and fried. This is something you wouldn't do to a Friday, of course, though you might do it on a Friday. You can also fry eggs on a Thursday if you like, or on a cooker. It's all rather complicated, but it makes a kind of sense if you think about it for a while. It's also good to know the difference between a lizard and a blizzard. This is quite an easy one. Although the two things sound very much alike, you find them in such very different parts of the world that it is a very simple matter to tell them apart. If you're somewhere inside the Arctic Circle, then what you're looking at is probably a blizzard. Whereas if you're in a hot and dry place like Madagascar or Mexico, it's more likely to be a lizard. I was telling somebody earlier today that I have a 4-year-old daughter and was very, very interested watching her face when she was in her first 2 or 3 weeks of life and suddenly realizing what nobody else would have realized in previous ages. She was rebooting.
Lovely, really lovely. Thank you.
My name is Lenny Henry. I have been knighted by the Queen. A small woman ran at me with a sword. It was one of my only experiences of a knife crime. She knighted me. I'm now Sir Lenny Henry, which is spelled C-U-R. I am a comedian. I started when I was kind of 12 years old, and then I won a big talent competition, a bit like America's Got Talent in Britain, but smaller and cheaper, with terrible sets. It was called New Faces. And I won that when I was 16 years old and was seen on British television by 16 million people who decided that I should never be out of work ever again. From there, I went on to do various things. I won a BAFTA award for Three of a Kind with Tracy Ullman and David Copperfield, not the David Copperfield, a David Copperfield. And then I got my own show called The Lenny Henry Show, and I was nominated for BAFTA for that. We did a parody of Michael Jackson's Thriller, and one of the lines of which was, "I'm getting thinner, thinner now," which I was very proud of. The other one was, "I can't eat my dinner." You know, it's kind of, I was 26. And then I did a television series a few years later called Chef, which seemed to be very popular. I'm looking at a cover of the New York Times with myself as Gareth Blackstock, the chef in question. So I've had a very long career. Some people might say too long. Really? You're still going? But it's been joyous. I've loved it. And it's paid for my mum's house. It's looked after my family. And it's paid for my children's education, my child's education. And it's kind of looked after me. And I've never been happier. They say you should do something that isn't like a job. And this has never, ever really felt like a job. So I'm very happy to be here. Lenny Henry, Sir at the front, if you like. You don't have to tug a forelock. You don't have to back out of a room when I'm here. You just have to say hi and maybe bring biscuits.
Fabulous. And Sir Lenny Henry, how did you meet not Sir Douglas Adams?
You should have been a Sir, though. I met Douglas Adams because I knew John Lloyd. I knew of Douglas because of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was famous on the radio and it was huge on the telly. But very selfish reasons. I was writing a one-man show. I was always very keen on writing and writers, and I wanted to meet as many as I could and just find out what I was doing wrong, you know. Is it wrong to write a first draft and then just to give it to Richard Curtis? That's wrong, isn't it? So I wanted to find out what you actually have to do when you become a writer. And I went to John Lloyd, who was one of the most brilliant script editors and producers in BBC Radio. He was producing, I think he was producing Not the 9 o'clock news at the time. I said to him, who would you introduce me to kind of mentor me about writing? He said, oh, you need to meet Douglas. I said, Douglas Adams? He said, yeah, you need to meet Douglas. And he arranged for me to go to Douglas's huge house in Islington in North London. And I went there. I was early, very nervous. I got to drink tea and eat biscuits and wait in his huge, everything was big about, because Douglas was about 9 feet tall. So his house had to be big to kind of look after him, make sure he fit in. Everywhere was built for Douglas in this house. So I'm sitting there and he comes in, and John Lloyd comes in. He says, I believe you've got a play you want to read to me. And I was so nervous. I was really nervous. And I said, yeah. And it was kind of a precursor to the one-man shows I do now, where I play all the characters. But I was just starting out and I didn't quite know what I was doing. And I read the whole thing. I think it took 3 hours. So there's a clue. This thing took a really long time to read. But he was brilliant. He laughed in all the right places, and John Lloyd laughed as well. And they said, you know, it's pretty good. It's not bad. They were being very kind. But it needs a bit of pruning. And Douglas said, would you like me to help prune? And I said, yeah, okay. And so he sat with me, I think for most of the afternoon, helping me to figure out what could go, what could be cut from this thing. It was like a masterclass in just sitting there with a cup of tea and reading your scripts out loud to see where you get bored. And then you cut that bit. And it was brilliant. I never did that one-man show, by the way, because there was a lot of work to do. And Douglas did point out to me that he was supposed to be writing something, and he was only doing this pruning so he could get away from doing actual writing. But he was wonderful. And then we became sort of friends. He'd invite me around for cups of tea and coffee and anything to not write. And he'd play the guitar. I think he liked to play The Boxer by some. I am just a poor boy with all my stories seldom told. And he'd play that, and he played guitar very, very well. And sometimes he'd invite me to listen to Paul Simon, and he'd play Take Me to the Mardi Gras, and he'd say, just listen to the end bit. And I go, well, I know this record. And then he had this brilliant stereo quadraphonic, Googleophonic system, and he'd turn up the end bit. And of course, when you turn up a Googleophonic system and you listen to the end of Take Me to the Mardi Gras, it's pretty crazy. It's beautiful. It goes to this great New Orleans kind of funereal march with kind of jazz playing, and it's a very groovy, bluesy riff that Paul Simon just sticks in at the end, and it's beautiful. And he was kind of saying things aren't over till they're over. You know, you can surprise people at the end of things. It was like a Douglas lesson, if you like. And I used to love him. I love the way he waved his hand at you when he talked. Now, what I think is this, and he waved his hand up and down at you. And he had parties. He had legendary parties. And people from the Beatles would be there, or the Pretenders or something, and they'd play. You went there thinking it would be a normal party, bottle of wine, a punch, maybe some coats on a bed. You get in there and there's a full band set up on stage, and Robbie Robertson's there from the Pretenders singing some song, and, you know, it was amazing. Everybody you knew would be at this party because Douglas knew everybody. And it was just a joy to know him. We really got on well. And I wasn't even one of his best friends. I was just one of the many people that Douglas liked being around. And I liked being around him.
Oh, that's wonderful. One of the reasons, there's so much there I want to dig into, but just
go ahead.
In no particular order. One of the reasons I asked you to read his little piece for children only is because I sensed, and you've told me, and maybe you could tell us about, you know, he had a relationship, or there's a story about him meeting your daughter, and of course you were both dads of only daughters, as am I.
Yeah, well, we adopted our daughter Billy in the early 90s. We've been trying for a baby for a long time, and we decided we'd already decided that we were going to adopt a child as well, and then we adopted Billy first, and we carried on trying, and it was a joy to adopt Billy. Actually, it was wonderful, but we didn't tell anybody. Nobody really knew. Only very, very close family knew that we had this tiny thing upstairs. She was 10 weeks old, and she arrived at the house, and she was cherished and oohed and ahed and worshipped and clothed, and she was beautiful. And she was in the cot upstairs for quite a long time. We didn't bring her down in case there were guests there, because we just wanted her to be for us. I don't know if you understand that, but we just wanted her to be our baby for a while before we unleashed her to the world. And Douglas came round. This is when we lived in Shinfield. Douglas came round. I knew him well enough that he would come to my house to moan about life. He came to my house to literally eat and have a glass of wine and to just moan and be anxious about writing and about delivering books on time or plays on time or films on time or arguments with America about the movie version of, which seems to have been going on for a very long time. He was just in a bit of a grumpy, miserable mood, you know? And I kind of went, I think do you want to meet someone? And he went, what do you mean? I said, you seem to need cheering up. I want to show you something that might cheer you up. So I said, follow me. So we tiptoed. I said, you've got to tiptoe. So we tiptoed upstairs and we turned left into Billy's room, and I switched on the nightlight, and there was Billy, and she was 10, 11 weeks old. And Douglas went, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. And he asked questions, and he was and it did flip it, actually. It did cheer him up no end. Because I think when you got little kids, he had a daughter. He just had his daughter, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think he just wanted to know that there was somebody else going through the same things that he was going through. It wasn't that he wasn't enjoying it, but everything else was crowding him. Mm-hmm. And I think he was looking for more time. You know, you always want more time to be with your family. But work, because we love work, and work has handholds that you can hold on to, even in the worst of times. You cleave and you lean into work, whereas actually you should lean into your family. And I think he realized that day.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's true. I think Polly and Billy must be very close in age. Polly is 31, I think, this year.
Yeah. Billy was Billy was a little bit older. She's 30. She's 30. She was 33 this year, Billy. Anyway, it happened. You know, he was soon to be a dad, and he kind of was anticipating that.
I mean, one of the things, of course, one of the great tragedies, maybe the biggest tragedy of his death, is that Polly has very little recollection of him. She was six, but she was 6 when he died. And one of the nice things I'm hoping that will come out, I'm doing this book in part because I miss him. I miss him, and I think the world misses him. Like, his intelligence and his way of looking at things differently would be useful to us around now.
Oh, God, yeah. He was such a smart guy. I loved reading his books, and I miss him very, very much. It's like when, you kind of have a moment, you think, I wonder what he'd be doing now. I wonder what John Lennon will be doing now. I wonder what Douglas will be thinking now. I wonder what music he'd be into. And of course, we'll never know, but you can guess. And I think the things he was doing, like saying, there'll be there's a bit in, I think it's Dirk Gently, when he's leaving messages on people's answer phones because he hasn't got a notebook and he's driving, and he tells a story about, it'd be cool if you've got your headlights on full beam and you came towards somebody, your headlights just dipped. It sensed that and it just dipped. And you're reading going, well, that's genius. That should happen. Everything he says has come true. I was reversing. Here's the thing. I was reversing out of my drive in my car the other day. It's an electric car and it has bells and whistles on it. And as I was reversing, the car just went and stopped. And everything on the dashboard turned red and it said brake in big letters. And a car went by. My car braked without me having anything to do with it. Just braked on its own. This is Douglas. Douglas is in our lives, people.
I think he is. It's so many.
He forecasts so many things.
Did you? Again, so let's talk about that for a second. So clearly, you're a fan as well. You've read all the books. You can quote bits of them, and you're a writer. And the interesting thing is, of course, Douglas wanted to be, when he was starting out, he wanted to be a writer performer. He sort of wanted to be a Python.
I think that's very clear. I did a Dirk Maggs, who seems to be recording every inch of Douglas's oeuvre, whether it's published or not, did a Hitchhiker special. And he gathers all these people that were in the old series and some other people too. And I was asked to play a role. I can't remember his name, but he was a kind of guy who knew everything, a know-it-all kind of guy. It was originally slated for John Cleese to play it in the original series, but it was cut, probably because Cleese was miserable that day and didn't want to do it. But I played it, and you could absolutely see that Douglas worships the Pythons and wrote it specifically for John Cleese to do. And I think you do that. I think that if you're a fan of people, like Eddie Izzard or like Robin Williams or Bill Murray or whoever, sometimes you do slip into that mode and go, I'm going to write this for this person, and I hope they like it. I hope when they read this or when they see it, they think, oh yeah, that's me. I can guess that.
So let's talk about comedy then, because you obviously are a comedian sort of first. That's what's in your bones for all the many other extraordinary things you've done. I feel like comedian is what sort of is in your marrow and what defines you. I think Douglas would have said the same about himself, even though his medium was different. Did you guys talk comedy specifically? Did you talk with the craft when he was listening to your monologue, or when you were giving each other notes?
He was very respectful. Comedy is how I paid for my mum's house. So, he knew that I'd had a career. I'd been in television for at least 10, 15 years and had my own television show in 84, 85, 86, 87, 88. Douglas knew me and knew what I did. And so it was very much a respectful game recognises game thing when I was reading in my play. And he was very interested to catch up on the rewrites. And actually, after a short period of time, when he just couldn't do it anymore, Alan Rickman took over and started to give me notes and stuff like that. And I think he was a recommendation for some reason. I don't know why. But it was, we did talk about comedy. We talked about being big because we're both big. I was big heavyset guy and Douglas was very tall, and how that can be funny sometimes. We talked about falling over. We talked about wordplay. I realised as I got older that I really respected the words on the page. And what I used to do was explode all the time. If I was in a writer's room, I wouldn't necessarily pitch jokes. I'd just try and be funny in the room. And Douglas said to me a really good thing. He said, well, that's writing too. He said, it's not just sitting in a room with a Tesco's carrier bag with a comb over and a fag, trying to write jokes like a hack. He says, sometimes, a lot of the time, getting up and messing around is what's funny. You know, if you look at Mel Brooks doing the 2,000-year-old man, he's riffing and making stuff up as he goes along. It's not written down. He and Carl Reiner are just riffing. If you watch Robin Williams in peak Morecambe Mindy, there are moments when he just takes off. And Douglas recognised that. But he loved to write. But I think he also loved the idea of being a performer too. I would have liked to have seen him perform. I'm sure he did do it at some point.
He gave a lot of talks. I mean, by the end, it was probably his main... I mean, he was rich in many different ways, but in terms of new income, he was getting paid very, very handsomely to do a lot of corporate talks. And
I can't imagine how handsome that pay would have had to be to pay Douglas more than he was earning. We're talking Brad Pitt handsome, right? We're talking peak Bob Redford handsome. That's how much money he was getting.
Well, I one of the things we found in the archive is some conference in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, that he's addressing. And in the bit of video that we have, he comes on and he starts by going, "Thank you, Richard Branson." So clearly Richard Branson introduced Douglas.
Oh my God, that's extraordinary. But yeah, he liked to talk, and I imagine him giving lots of talks. I wasn't involved in that part of his life, but I had, you know, a really interesting thing, because after he died, I was at his funeral, but after he died, shortly after that, I started to work with John Cantor, the writer, and John Cantor used to share a flat with Douglas. And so this rekindled all my memories of Douglas. And because John was with him through girlfriends and just writing books and being hip and staying up all night thinking and drinking and talking and laughing. And so it was like having another lease of my Douglas relationship, because John loved Douglas like I did, and we just talked about him a lot. Every so often we get into a thing where we talk about how Douglas used to wave his hand up and down at you from a great height while he explained some complex joke that he'd just written. And so the John Cantor connection, and I wrote with John for most of the 90s, was a joyous addition to my Douglas memory bank.
Oh, how wonderful. One thing that's becoming clear doing these conversations is Douglas loved friendship. He had so many people who he's, just enjoyed spending time with, generally talented people. I think, like you, he got famous and successful, not as young as you, but in his 20s. When Hitchhikers comes out when he's 27, 28. And despite his sort of tales of his years in the wilderness, he actually didn't.
He was really... Well, it seems to me that the Cambridge Radio, Hitchhiker's Guide, books, boom, was quite a quick thing.
Yeah, he had maybe 3 years of doing odd jobs, but even then he was, going round to Graham Chapman's house and being his writing assistant whilst Graham drank bottles of gin.
Yes, I remember that bit. He used to tell me about Graham, and he also told me about the relationship between John and Graham. It was very good because he taught me about writing relationships and sometimes having to take the lead in that relationship and what that was like. And I remember he talked about the work that went into Hitchhikers and how, in many respects, it was a team effort, and how it can put noses out of joint when you sort of say, well, I'm going to write this.
Yes.
I'm going to write this. When you say, if you've been working in a gang, making a radio show, and you suddenly take the lead and go, well, I'm going to write this because it's my idea and I'm off, it can put noses out of joint. But in the end, they made up, I think, and they got on with their lives. But Douglas definitely went, I'm going to do this. This is my thing, and I'm going to write the books because it's me.
And that was obviously the right decision. perhaps could have handled it differently. I think he wrote John Lloyd a letter, but
it's like sending a text now, right?
Yes.
Dude, I'm out of here. I'm gonna write this shit.
Let's talk about music, because you told that wonderful story about him playing the end of Paul Simon's song. He talks about Paul Simon as the reason he plays guitar. He talks, hearing Paul Simon at school. Paul Simon's left-handed, as was Douglas, and
I forgot he was a lefty.
And I think that led him as a teenager to start, to buy his first left-handed guitar. But he also, he was obsessive. Well, he was obsessive about everything, it seems to me. But he was obsessive about music. I think he would listen to the same songs over and over and over and over. He famously wrote the whole of the first Dirk Gently book listening to A Whiter Shade of Pale. Am I saying that right?
A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum.
Yes. Just listen to that song on repeat.
That doesn't surprise me. Those boys, those Cambridge, Oxbridge boys, they have these little gangs. And I know there's a gang of a group of people who, Richard Curtis, Angus Deaton, all those people, they have a gang where they talk about Python and they talk about Bob Dylan. And they have a night where they have a curry, I think, and they decide which is the best Bob Dylan record. And I'm pretty sure if Douglas had been alive, he would have been in that gang, waving his hand in the air, saying, no, you must listen to this, because he loved his music so much. And that's why, his parties, which were a birthday party, I think, or just before Christmas, were things where he gave as a gift a musical performance by someone. There'd be somebody famous singing at this party, and it could be anybody. It could be anybody up there, and Douglas might play. And it was always joyous, always fun. A bit white, you never saw Kool and the Gang, but you might see three guys who were all in Paul McCartney's backing group, or you might see somebody from Chrissie Hynde's band, or you might see half a Beatle or something. You saw people at that party, and it was a proper gift of, I can afford this. This is my gift to you. We're going to have a gig in my living room. Check it out. And he always played music. He loved music. He never really asked me what I was listening to. I'm not sure Douglas would have been into Bootsy Collins or some bloke singing Let Me Clear My Throat. But he was very good at bestowing what he liked on you. Mm-hmm. He never really convinced me about Dylan. But I did do a show about Bob Dylan, inspired by Douglas, kind of, where I explored the whole Dylan thing. And I talked to lots of people like Adele and Brian Ferry about why do you like Bob Dylan so much? And I would have asked Douglas the same question, all about the writing. Now, Douglas, as you know, had ideas about writing, and he knew where he was in the pantheon, and he respected, game recognises game. And I think anybody who puts his heart and soul into writing beautiful melodies and wonderful lyrics had Douglas's heart. And I think Dylan had his heart, as did many other performers, Paul Simon, for instance. He loved music to his heart and soul, which was when I went to his funeral and saw Dave Gilmour there and other people playing because they loved Douglas too. That was a very moving thing for me to watch Dave Gilmour playing "Wish You Were Here," just with the guitar. It was beautiful.
Well, the thing that most of those musicians who he loved had in common. So Douglas obviously had a deep love of music. I mean, he loved classical music. He loved Bach. Famously, he said, "Listening to Bach is listening to the sound of the universe." And
wow.
The full quote is, "Listening to Beethoven teaches you about being Beethoven. Listening to Mozart teaches you about being human. Listening to Bach teaches you about the universe."
Wow. That's great. And listening to the Temptations teaches you about the ghetto. It was the 3rd of September, a day I'll always remember. Yes, I will.
But the thing about most of those musicians, most of the pop musicians he loved, I think, is they were storytellers.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful compression in the lyrics and poetry in the lyrics and stories in the lyrics. You said something
I think he got that.
So go.
I think he got that. And as I was saying earlier, game recognises game. Anybody who is brave enough to put their head above the parapet, like Dylan or Tom Waits or Chrissie Hynde or people like that, he recognised that and he respected it. I imagine he loved Tom Waits. I don't know because I never asked him. But that sense of, or Joni Mitchell, I'm going to tell you a story, listen to this, but doing it with music and the compression of lines. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. I've tried to write songs, and trust me, it's very difficult. And Douglas knew that.
Well, they can't be 3 hours long, for one thing.
Yeah, they can.
So talking about game recognizing game, there's a story about Dylan and Leonard Cohen going on a road trip around France together.
Oh my God!
I mean, what to
that must have been amazing.
To be a fly ball, and Cohen talks about it later, writes about it, and somewhere in the conversation, Dylan says to him, "Hallelujah, that's a good song. How long did it take you to write that one?" And Cohen goes, "Well, so far 30 years, still working on it."
Wow.
He says, and Cohen says, "All Along the Watchtower, how long did it take you to write that one?" And Dylan goes, "About 3 minutes."
Right.
And they were just built differently. And then there's another moment where Dylan says, Cohen's having a real sort of, crisis of confidence. And Dylan goes, "Don't be ridiculous. You're in the top 3 of all time. You're top 3 of all time." And Cohen, sort of very flattered and reassured by this, says, "Okay, so obviously there's you at 1, and then I'm at 3. Who do you think is number 2? And Dylan goes, No, I'm 0.
That's like an A plus. That's like an A plus star, 2 stars. There's a great story. There's a story in the Rolling Stone book about Dylan and Joni Mitchell being at a party, and they listened to Dylan's first album on Geffen, and then Joni Mitchell very shyly puts her album on, and Dylan falls asleep.
Oh my God, that's crushing.
Which is awful. But apparently she forgives him because he was naughty like that. But in terms of Douglas, I do think that although he was part of that Oxbridge thing, I do think he was apart from it. I know everybody knew him, but there was something else about Douglas, something about the writing and the creating and the ability to create worlds and to just think so differently from anybody else, so differently from Cleese or Chapman or Palin or any of those people he respected. He was apart from that. And I think he was very, very incredibly generous with his time and his advice and his thought processes. He didn't mind telling you that writing was incredibly difficult. He found it very, I don't know why, because when you read it, it just flows. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it takes hours and hours of beating yourself up to come up with those lines, to come up with that dialogue, to make yourself laugh, to cut the extraneous bit that you don't need, to discover that extraneous bit. Douglas had a real skill of writing that made you think, God, he's really thought about this. And I love that about him.
I think the thing that set him apart was his willingness to think about everything. Yes, he was a comic writer, but he thought about the world in a way you don't quite see Cleese, or Cleese just sort of rants about everything these days. But Douglas engaged in technology, in conservation, in music, in the internet, and so he engaged with these big subjects.
Yeah, he was an early adapter, I think, of things. He liked to, that whole thing about rare animals, going to see, Last Chance to See, I think he did, didn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think the meaning of Liff that he did with John Lloyd, and the early adaptation of the internet, all that stuff you're talking about. And then what happens is when you adapt early, you start to have ideas about what else is there? What other kind of animal is there? What other kind of things could you do with the internet? What in technology hasn't been done? And when you're thinking like that, you're ahead of the game. I think he stayed ahead of the curve for an incredibly long time, just with this ability to game things out and think things through to the ultimate conclusion. He was good at that. And I think that's why he got the big bucks from Richard Branson, is because he wasn't scared to go, well, what would happen if this happened?
I think that's right. Something else that you guys, I guess, have in common is using comedy and using your platform for good. You obviously on a very huge scale with Comic Relief, but Douglas mainly focused on animals. He was patron of the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. He was a trustee of Save the Rhino. Did you guys talk about that? Was that a sense of something important to him, or was it just something fun to do?
I think we didn't really talk about it because, when you're doing stuff like that, the minute you start thinking, I'm going to go and save the animals, or I'm going to, it becomes virtue signaling. And he certainly didn't do that. This was just something he knew he had to do. He was compelled to do it. He wasn't being a savior. He wasn't coming to the rescue. He was just doing it because it was the right thing to do. You know, imagine a world without rhinos. And the minute Douglas starts to riff like that, he's being thoughtful, funny, but also empathic. A world without rhinos or butterflies or raccoons would be a terrible thing. So let's think about what we need to do to save that, to think about how to preserve that. And similarly, you know, with Comic Relief, he knew I was doing it, and he knew it was a big thing. You know, I was doing things like Mandela Day too, but we didn't talk about that stuff because that was stuff we were doing. The main things we talked about were music, comedy, and where to get a decent bagel at 2:00 in the morning.
This is fantastic.
His thing was Brick Lane. I kept saying Tesco's, but he didn't believe me.
He was right, for the record. The Brick Lane bagels are actually bagels and not
I know.
They don't have a hole, for one. They don't need the hole. But the hole is virtue signaling in bagels.
Yeah. I have to say, he was a friend to me. He gave me lots of advice. He was the first person to see Billy outside of the family. And he repeatedly invited me to his party until he passed away. And then I was honoured to be invited by his family to the funeral. Funerals are a thing, you know. You don't just show up. I know some people do, but you don't just show up. So I felt incredibly sad, but also chuffed to have been included in that. It was a big deal to me. I think about him a lot. I often think about what he'd be thinking about the streamers and the BBC losing audience figures and the loss of confidence in comedy in terms of the main broadcasters. I wonder what he'd say about that. He'd probably say we have to do something that they can't ignore. You know, you have to do things that they can't ignore. It's very difficult these days to get a new idea off the ground. If you think about Hitchhikers and things like Ab Fab, you don't see those things every day. And I think Douglas was one of the kind of people who knew that and knew that he'd been blessed by the gods or something. He produced something that would keep him in fur sinks and rock bands in his living room for the rest of his days. And God bless him, it really did.
It really did. Lenny Henry, thank you.
Thank you very much. How lovely to talk about Douglas.